Nice of you to come on this beautiful evening. If you're interested in signing up to help build the Ark, Amy will take your name after the meeting. I'd like to thank those members of the committees who showed up for the public forums that were held the week before last at Transit Middle School and that were held this week at Amherst Middle School. The transit one was not as well attended as the one at the Amherst Middle School, but both of them had some good questions, and I think there was good participation from the public that were at both of them. So we got some good information out of it and some food for thought and some things maybe that we never thought of before. So it's very good to have public input so that we can maybe get a better idea about some things that we didn't consider, because maybe at times we get too close. So, again, thank you for the members of the committee that attended. Has everyone had an opportunity to look at the last month's meeting notes, and are there any comments on the meeting notes? Yes, ma'am. Yes, there was a lot of discussion on them. Yep. And do you intend to bring that up?
Actually, what I'm going to do is following along the provide you the places where this is changed.
So I guess the answer to your question is yes. Any other comments or questions? If not, we'll send the meeting notes on. Okay. Dan is going to talk about the public information meetings, and then we're going to go right into the changes that were suggested and what we're going to do. So, Dan?
Okay, so good evening. Is this... So yeah, good evening. As Dal mentioned, we did hold 2 public information meetings over the last couple weeks, and received some good input from those. I'm going to go through those comments. I'm going to go through the comments that were made last week, or last meeting, I'm sorry, the last meeting of the committee. I'm going to go through those first, because I want to make sure you understand what was changed as a result of your conversation. And then we're going to go back and we're going to go through the document. We'll go through it page by page, not necessarily stopping at each page. It'll depend on what comments you have. And where we have places that we receive public comment, we'll stop there and I'll let you know where those comments apply to the text of the plan. Hopefully you've all had a chance to look at the public comments, at least review them. Not very many comments, or not very much? Yeah, there's not a lot. I think we probably had about, what, 30, a little over 30 folks between the two meetings. So, what I'd like to do is just go through your comments first, and then we'll go back through again. So, first thing is, everybody on the committee, I assume, has the latest version of chapters 3 and 10 that were mailed to you previously. So I'm gonna refer back to the meeting notes, but I'm just gonna kind of walk through this. It may not be in order, exactly in order, so bear with me. I'm gonna go through the order of the notes. Kelly Dixon from the GBNRTC made a comment later in the meeting that we had related to incorporating some language into the plan that reflected the findings of the town's economic study and maybe the trends that are ongoing in the commercial development world that were reflected in Dave Russell's report. So on pages 2 and 3, there's been text added there that is intended to respond to her comment and to incorporate the information that Dave Russell provided to us. There's some demographic information there, and then there's some information about trends in commercial development that were added as well. So I'm going to start there at 2 and 3. I'm going to assume that folks have had a chance to look at this, so I'm not going to go through this word by word. I'm going to ask if there's any comments about anything that was added there, and we can discuss that if you'd like. What that doesn't surprise me. Dave?
Let me start by saying I went through this, and I really want to read it again. There's a lot here. There's a lot to read and digest, and for me anyways, it takes a couple of reads to really understand things, and some of my comments tonight might be premature, because if I read it again, I may see it in a different context. But notwithstanding, I thought one of the comments in here, the second bullet in particular, is that suburban retail quarters and business parks are not, as referred to the millennial generation, how they're viewed, and not necessarily viewed very desirably. And yet, as I was going through the entire plan and coming back to that and saying, okay, so maybe I misunderstand what millennials are looking for, but how does the balance of this plan respond to that comment? Because there's only a few comments here, so each one should be taken with some merit. But if we're trying to understand what millennials want, if they don't like this, then what is it they like, and is the plan really responding to that, and do we care?
I'm not going to... Does anybody have any comments on that? Any thoughts on that?
How about if I have a little bit of a response? I mean, one of the things that's happened here is that we're taking some of the findings of Dave Russell's report and we're incorporating them into the text here. At the same time, we're not going to be making any changes to the plan that respond to what the call was in terms of the findings of that study. It's our intent to move forward in the coming year to do something which is somewhat parallel to this, where we're looking at specifically on office uses and what sort of changes might be necessary in the policy statements in the plan in regard to office uses, and then finally what we might do in terms of some of our office districts, and there may be more than one now other than just having that one, what we have to do in order to position ourselves to make them more economically viable, provide opportunities for the private sector to make changes to them that make them more economically viable. So we're at a bit of a juncture here when it comes to that. That's not off the table at this point in time. It's just not going to happen as part of this exercise.
Comments on that? Dave, do you have any specific changes you'd like to make as a result of your review?
I may make some broader comments today, and we'll have to review timeline again, but what I really want to do, and I don't remember if we received the Word version of this as well, but what I really love to do is go back through it and provide some written comments, like in a margin, like in a Word, in a Word, to kind of provide it back that way, just because I read through it, made a lot of comments, but I want to go back and read through it again and may alter some of the comments I made early on because I read something later. But, I was looking at some of the points in here. It talks about, see, now I have to read by scribbling here, make sure I can make sense of it, but I'll save these comments for later, thanks.
You set? Okay, so we're not sure. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? Anybody else? Duncan?
I guess I happened to read this slightly different than David did, in that I read this as that the millennials are not happy with what we have now and are looking for changes, and I interpreted it that that's the way we're looking at creating a lot of these new, or re-envisioning the spaces that we're looking at, is that they would end up being more of what the millennial is looking at. So I guess maybe part of it's just an interpretation of the wording or how this was being disseminated to us.
Unfortunately, we've not had too many millennials or the younger generation engaged in this process to provide some of that direct feedback, and that's unfortunate. So the question is, I wasn't asking the question rhetorically earlier, but I was trying to say, do we understand what millennials are looking for? It's one thing to say, maybe that don't like what's there, but is what we're doing responsive to that? Because at the end of the day, next 10 or 15 years, however long this plan's supposed to be in place, is really going to be for that millennial generation that may consider moving or recreating or working in the town. And are we going in the path that they would find attractive? That's all.
I'd like to make one more comment, because I think I may have misled David. And actually, what Duncan has said actually led to my epiphany here. And that is that I think that when we were dealing with the commercial areas, we are talking about making them multi-use, and those areas could be more attractive to millennials. I think the information that was put in here, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong here, was information that came from a study which was not specifically about commercial areas. It was about the office areas in town, and we need to, and this is my belief, I think we need to treat some of those areas in a similar manner to the way we're treating our commercial areas as part of this action.
Yeah, I think in respect to Rick's comment too, remember the office and industrial land use sections are included in this chapter. So this addresses both the retail corridors and the business park. So it's set up in some ways to address that later on, whatever project we're able to execute next year. So I guess what we'll have to do is get to the end, and we'll talk a little bit more about this to see where you're at in that case. No one else has got any. Dan, you got something? Frank, what Dan?
I share David's initial concerns. If we're emphasizing too much that we're being driven by millennials' demand, I mean, when I look at trends in mixed use, it's beyond just millennials. It's the seniors that are aging in place, and we would like them to age in place within an area that provides all the amenities they need. Right now, a lot of our seniors are in senior housing developments without people of different socioeconomic classes and age groups, and we're trying to create something that includes everyone. So I can see the concern for putting too much emphasis on millennials' needs and this being driven just by millennials.
Can I add to that? I guess I was hung up on the fact that we were talking about one group, one generation, but I don't think we are. I think what we're really talking about is writing the changes to the current trends in land use development. Maybe millennials are driving that. Maybe we don't know what one group wants, but I don't think it's just for one group. I think it's for to meet the current trends, and maybe that could be a change here if anyone's hung up on the term of the millennial generation.
Is that one working on?
Yes. I think I kind of agree with Gary there. I think you could easily just kind of quell a lot of what people are seeing by just striking the millennial generation. I think overall, it's not just millennials who are out of favor with being in office parks. That's kind of an everybody thing. And speaking as an almost millennial, I can say that's probably true for everyone.
I think this is pretty accurate. I think all you need to do is look at downtown Buffalo. I work downtown. It's incredible the development that's taken place, the conversion of warehouses and things into living quarters. And as more people are drawn downtown, it attracts other business. So I think that looking at multi-use down the road is very important, and whether it deals with office parks that maybe no longer would stand alone as an office park, but perhaps could also have people living in those areas, multi-use, I think is very important.
So there's quite a bit of dissatisfaction with using the term millennial. So I think that's a word we could probably strike from here. And what I'm hearing is perhaps we try for a term that's more general, but reflects this change that both younger and maybe middle-aged, even older folks are expressing a preference for this form of development over the more traditional forms. If we craft something to that effect, would that be address the concern? Okay, all right. We'll work that. I would say this at the end, but and I probably will anyway. We're not going to get this 100% tonight. There's going to be some editorial things that are going to have to be made, changes are going to have to be made here. At the end, we're probably going to ask you, as we did the last time, whether you're comfortable enough with what's here and the changes that we discuss here to allow us to move this forward. And we can reserve that discussion and that decision for later, but that would be the goal, to move this forward as a result of our discussion tonight. So, any other thoughts on pages 2 and 3? Yes, ma'am.
25 to 34?
It's up to...
I missed the cutoff, but it's 1981 and up. 25 to 34.
94. 1981 to 1994.
Okay. So I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna go to pages.
Dan, can I just ask
Yeah.
one thing? Kelly Dixon, I thought made a great point at our last meeting about the fact that this is being funded entirely by NYSERDA, and the fact that we should be looking at ways to reduce the carbon footprint. And I mean, I don't see any mention of anything relative to the original mission of this project that was funded by NYSERDA. Just wanted to throw that out there. I thought Kelly's comments at our last meeting were very point on.
Do you have any suggestions?
I don't. I'd have to look at the original grant that was provided.
Sure. I think that there's some validity to that statement. I'm not sure where we incorporate it. We're sometimes a little reluctant to use terms like resiliency and sustainability because they have a shelf life and they have different interpretations. I mean, if you have some thoughts on where that could be incorporated here, more than open to those suggestions. Okay, the next comment I have from the committee is on pages 38 through 41, and it really deals with building height. So it's quite a long section that's dealt with here. So if we go to page 38. So the committee had expressed some concerns about building height, primarily the 10-story height that was originally suggested. Lee came back and changed that. I will admit that the diagram for center, or the figure for center, still lists 3 to 10 stories, but the text is 3 to 8, so the diagram would be corrected to reflect that. So the first discussion of height that we had was 10 stories, the 10-story thing. We had a discussion about that. I think folks generally felt that was too high, although there was some comments about permitting that kind of height in areas that already had those kinds of buildings. I think Ellen made a comment, if it exists somewhere, then is that a place where we could consider that kind of height? That's certainly not what I heard, so Yeah.
I mean, my understanding of it was, that sites that had buildings of that height would be kind of grandfathered into other buildings of that height, and maybe I wasn't clear, but I was suggesting that I prefer not to go that way.
Okay, so you're talking grandfather, well, so that means the building, if the building's already there, it's there. But you're not saying that because there's an area that has a 10-story building, that there couldn't be another one there, in close, distance to that, right? Okay, all right. Well, okay, so the recommendation from the committee and Lee's change, put it to 8 stories. Okay, well, let's, I don't think so.
What we actually voted on doing was not expressly stating stories in this section, because it would get interpreted too literally. And if you look at this section, it talks about 3 to 8 stories, and then the following sentence says there are some existing taller buildings should not be allowed in the future. Well, what's taller? Is it 3 stories? Is it 5 stories? Is it 8 stories? How literally do we interpret this? So we talked last time about not putting in numerical, and I think we actually voted on not doing numerical numbers in here, and yet they appeared again.
Okay, I think, and my interpretation of that was, it was square footage and things of that nature. It was not necessarily the stories, so.
Oh, well, the topic was raised with regard to stories.
Right there, it's wrong.
After reading the notes, didn't Lee suggest that the number of stories be included?
Yes.
But did we talk about 8 at the last meeting, or did we talk about something closer to 6? I don't know where the number 8 came from.
Yeah.
During the meeting, I'll stand corrected.
I don't recall 8. I know it started at 10, and, my recollection is that we suggested that we go with a description such as in the centers is where you would find the largest of the buildings in form and in height, etc., rather than, as David had pointed out, we didn't want to put a numerical description. That was my recollection.
Yeah, so, I think Lee's point was you're probably better off providing some level of guidance in the plan, and recognize, of course, that when it gets to the code, it's going to be very strictly defined. And so the guidance in the plan is meant to guide the drafting of the code.
But this section is just describing what a center is, not what it has to be. So I interpreted this section when we talked about it last week. I specifically asked, am I misinterpreting the intent of these next few sections? They're intending to describe in the town what a typical center is, so you can contrast that with what a corridor is. So, for example, in this center, if it said that in the centers typically have the tallest buildings of all of the different zones, that communicates that the center is where the most intense development is, without necessarily expressly stating it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 stories. So, and then there's opportunities later on, particularly when we get into specific areas, where we can get specific about what's appropriate here and there. But when I'm reading this, I'm not only reading what's intended, and I understand it's not an easy task to write this stuff, but how it's going to get used a year, 2, 3, 4 years from now. And I'm trying to minimize, it's still going to happen, how intentions can get misinterpreted and misused later on and create real hardship. So if all we're trying to do here is describe the differentiation between what a center is versus a corridor versus whatever, then I don't know that we need to get that explicit with the numerics to be able to describe that. That's this point we made last week that I think I'm still making again this time around, or last meeting this time around. I'm not suggesting that we should do tall buildings. I'm just trying to get the language right, because and the objective of this section is just to kind of create an understanding of where the intense development is, and this is lesser intense, and this is least intense.
Yeah, I totally concur. I thought that's the direction we were going.
And I think the way we interpreted it was that there was specific language in here about the actual size and scale of the buildings. And that was clear to me that was something that folks wanted out. And so in order to address that, what we did is, because I think Lee's comment was, you need to provide some level of guidance in here, or it's gonna be very difficult when rezonings come to the board, it's gonna be very difficult to look at those and just kind of be open-ended about what it's gonna be with fairly loose language, I think, is what he probably intended to say, although I don't want to put words in his mouth.
So what does the second sentence mean then? How does one interpret that? Because it's going to become a magical phrase that people use over and over. There are some existing taller buildings in Amherst, but these should not be allowed in the future. That's a definitive statement. Does that mean a 3-story building's a taller building? Does that mean a 6-story building's a taller building? Once you have a range in there of 3 to 8, if I'm looking at this conservatively, I can say, well, 3 stories is a taller building, so therefore they're not allowed in the future. That's the prison that you end up in when you start using these terms. And so I have a great respect for Lee.
Sure.
I think he's wrong.
Okay. What I've heard over the course of the many meetings we've had is that there is a concern about height. So I suspect that's why he's incorporated that in here.
That's not even what I'm arguing. I'm not even arguing about height. I'm arguing about the inclusion of numbers in a paragraph that's simply describing what a center is as the most intense area of development within the town. That's all this is doing. I'm not even talking about height.
Well, but that seems to be part of the issue, and
If you guys had all 3 of them over here.
We're collecting.
I don't know what's going on over here.
We're talking in stereo.
But I think, as I've heard the discussions over the last several months, that height is an issue, and it seemed like that was something that people wanted incorporated into the guidance. So with that, I think that's what he interpreted it as. So I guess we need to make a decision as to how we want to go forward with this.
Do you have to read both sentences then?
Dan?
Yeah.
I have a suggestion.
Yep.
I don't think many people would interpret 3 to 8 and then some taller as meaning taller than 3. But this could easily be fixed by just saying there are some buildings taller than 8 stories. Because the intention of it isn't, yes, there are some buildings taller than 3 stories. It's that there's a 3 to 8 range and some are even taller. But would it be clearer if we just said, and some buildings are taller than 8 stories? Then it's obvious that it cannot be construed as some buildings are taller than 3 stories.
I'm in agreement with that to a certain extent. If we have to have something in here, I'd prefer it just says up to X number of stories, because if you want to interpret the way everyone's saying can't be higher than 3, you're going to say you can't be lower than, or higher than 8, it can't be lower than 3. It has to be at least a 3-story building. And that's not what we're trying to say on any of these parcels, so I think we should take our part, and if, I'm one that says don't put any in at all at this point, but if we have to, let's just say it shall not exceed X number of stories, so that at least there's some latitude there.
I think if it ends up that we have to have numbers, be it stories or height, I'm not quite sure how we would say 8, which I believe would be giving us something greater than 65 feet, which is now the maximum. I understand there's a few, and very few buildings that are taller than 65 feet, 8 or 10 stories, but that's rare. So if we have to have a number, why would we, after everything we've talked about for these months, have it higher than 65 feet?
And I'm going to concede to the point she made that when I read this, I didn't read that sentence, that's why I said I want to read it again, to mean that next sentence about the buildings that were taller than 8 stories. I just thought about there are taller buildings in the town, whether it be 4, 5, or 6, however somebody wants to interpret taller. So I think her clarification actually helps clarify that second sentence that's referring to buildings that are taller than 8 stories that we want to do again, versus just buildings that are referred to as the taller buildings in the town, whether it be 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 stories. So I think at a minimum, I'd want to clarify the second sentence. I still maintain my position, we don't need to state stories, but at a minimum, I want to clarify I would agree with her clarification on the second sentence.
I'm gonna ask Kim or Amy if they got the sense, or Ellen, do you wanna state that again, or how you would have that read specifically?
Well, one option, I agree.
So you can use the microphone, please. Thanks.
Given these large parcel sizes, buildings are often 3 to 8 stories in height. There are some existing buildings taller than 8 stories in Amherst, but these should not be allowed, et cetera. Or 65 feet, I mean, either way.
I don't know how 8 got to be the standard.
I'm just trying to clarify the language, then.
Well, and I do like
Is that what we-
feet over stories, because different building types have different story heights than, I think, first of all, I'm just so tired of hearing about building heights, like a polarizing, singular subject, and there's so many things that go into the planning buildings and project size, density, mass, everything else, but nonetheless, we've been talking about stories, it's easy to do that, but height is a much more clarifying term than stories, because you can have a lower story, 3-story building, and a very tall 4-story building.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that, and we may go back to your experience to help clarify the discussion we had with Lee today about the expression of height in terms of feet or stories. We'll talk about that in a few minutes.
In regards to feet, 65 feet tall instead of using stories, there would be nothing to prevent, just looking at zoning board folks here, that people could come and ask for variances to be even taller. Do we want to address that at all in regards to this plan?
I don't think it's something that's addressed in the plan. The plan sets out what the town's goals are, then the zoning puts numbers and sizes and stories, feet, square feet, whatever, puts some standards to it, but people still have the right to appeal a decision or ask for something different. I don't think you can say in a plan, there shall be no variances. Not the purpose.
However, the existence of this plan in this language would make it that much harder for a ZBA to appropriately grant.
The more detail, the better.
Correct.
Just listening to the discussion, it would seem to me that the kind of limitations that you're talking about, Ramona, might best be put into the zoning code. I mean, there's a series of criteria that are supposed to be used by the Zoning Board of Appeals, and my understanding is that they do use those. But you can expand that list of criteria in a way that tends to at least provide an opportunity for the Zoning Board of Appeals to make some sort of a rational decision about height and height variances that are being requested. But I'm not sure about whether or not that's something that could be included within the comprehensive plan. I say that with some trepidation, because for the large degree, the Zoning Board of Appeals is a creation of state legislation, and they are limited. Our ability to limit them, I think, is limited somewhat by that state legislation.
Does that answer your question?
As long as it's, you said about the state legislature, and I don't know what all the restrictions are for the zoning board, but if something could be put in the zoning code, because if this is supposed to be more general, the specifics are in the zoning code, I'd be okay with that.
But no matter what goes into the zoning code, anybody has a right to appeal it. So it can still go before the Board of Appeals any time.
And the ZBA has plain standards that they're supposed to use when they're considering a request, and, these documents exist. So, for example, if there's a party that was either denied a variance or a party that was granted a variance but another party didn't like it, the stronger the language is in here about what the town looking for provides these things typically get litigated, that's what happens. So when they get litigated, everyone goes back to the documents, what's the intent of the plan, what's the intent of the town, the zoning board acted arbitrarily and capriciously because it ignored this kind of thing. So typically, this language that's in here, and what you're trying to create is a document that says this is what we want, and then if there's litigation that occurs as a result of it because a board didn't adhere to that, that provides the framework for successful litigation by the party pursuing it. But the ZBA could ultimately still do what it wants to do, and an applicant can still apply for a variance, but the documents exist to kind of protect somebody in case that decision's made improperly.
With that said, I'm almost jumping to another topic here besides height, then if we could, environmental concerns, can we put in here that, like not building in floodways and things of that nature?
I think there is some discussion about that, but I think there are other rules and regulations. Those areas are regulated by other agencies, FEMA, others that permit, that probably just throw it down to Jim, that would permit some development in those areas. So we can encourage that, put in language that encourages that, but I don't think we can restrict it or disallow it.
Ramona, could you repeat your question, clarify your question? Because I'm not sure I got the gist of it.
We're looking at height, and then it just occurred to me about other concerns that the ZBA is facing in regards to property and environmental concerns as well, such as building in a floodway or next to a floodway.
Yeah.
I was wondering if we could, because I think all of you know how I feel about Northeast Amherst.
Yeah.
And not to have rampant building up there because of my concerns for the future for that area.
Yeah. Now that I understand your question, the answer is definitely yes. I mean, in the current floodplain regulations in the town zoning code does prohibit structures in the floodway, not in the floodplain. But if there's additional regulation that would be appropriate for the floodplain itself, then that could be incorporated into those provisions that are currently in the code.
Ramona, Chapter 4 of the comprehensive plan currently identifies all of our natural resources and our goals to protect them. 4.2, goals and objectives and policies. Sensitive environmental and cultural resources identified and preserved as part of the physical fabric of the community. Objectives: establish an interconnected open space network that incorporates significant natural and cultural resources. Protect sensitive environmental resources through improved regulation, policies, and management, including water resources and wetlands, air quality, trees and woodlands. So, I think the comp plan in that particular chapter addresses all of our natural resource concerns and what we're doing to protect them. So I don't know if it's necessary to put it in this section.
As I said, I think we can put language, or we have language in there that encourages or discourages those kinds of things occurring, but I don't know that we can put specific language in here that deals specifically with those issues in those areas.
And some of it's self-regulating, because obviously when we file an application for a project, and we've got to provide stormwater plans that are reviewed by the agencies and subject to seeker and everything else, so a lot of the applications for projects in those parts of town will be subject to those other self-regulating parts that are components of the review process, notwithstanding I think the general guideline information in here and some of the selections we've made about how we're identifying and allowing certain development to occur in certain corridors to kind of minimize the likelihood of an application for a maybe too intense kind of development.
Well, I guess I have a recent issue that came in front of the town board that wanted to be built right next to a floodway, and the detention pond was like in the floodway, which made it like useless to me if Ransom Creek flooded. And the board denied it. Now it's going to be in front of the zoning board, and I don't know what they have to be able to concur with the town board on that. So I would like language, so these types of situations don't happen in the future. That's what I'm looking at.
I think we can address it in any future amendments to the zoning ordinance. I have similar concerns. For instance, when we look at our transition areas, in Chapter 4 again, we strive for tree preservation, but we allow the clear cutting of forest communities to provide detention basins. Whereas I would prefer that we establish something in the zoning ordinance that says that you have to look at a transition first, maintain as much natural vegetation for that transition, and then whatever land's left over, you can use your stormwater management. Because there are other options. Surely they're more expensive. You can store your stormwater underground in a parking lot, but so I think within the zoning ordinance itself, we have to look at how we can improve some of these standards that can meet multiple objectives. Natural resource preservation, increase our transitions that we want between these unlike uses. So I think that's where we should look for some amendments to meet all these multiple objectives.
I think we talked about this, I think you raised this question before, and I think at that time Lee indicated that the zoning code would be the appropriate place to incorporate that kind of thing. And I think he was open to that. I think Alan may have mentioned that as well. So I would suggest that that's probably the place where we can address that more specifically. Okay, so we still have an issue that I'm not sure has been resolved, and that is the height, 3 to 8 stories. Is that, and actually, let's just talk about the height that's specified for each one of these in the diagram on page 338. Are we okay with the heights that are there? These are heights that we've been discussing. So, and I would submit that the height that's recommended in the section that discusses corridors would be added to the diagram for corridor. It's not there now.
I'd like to suggest something if I could. In the diagrams where it says buildings are, instead of buildings are, can it be buildings may be? Because we're looking at this, it's not an absolute.
Yeah, I think it's confusing because we mix future and past issues here. I mean, even if we look at this illustration, I can't imagine anywhere in Amherst where I see this type of corridor. It might be a good illustration of a future desired corridor, so I think we need to describe existing or future.
So we're jumping a little bit. We're going to get to that. So again, I think in response to the committee's concern about the use of specific metrics in the plan, the metrics were taken out for the most part, with the exception of height, and we asked that they add some diagrams in here that give an indication of what the desired scale and form of development is in each one of these places. I will tell you that the sketches you have incorporated in here are not the ones that you'll see when the plan amendment is finally adopted. There will be diagrams that are drawn specifically for areas in the town of Amherst that are typical of these different types. And they'll be incorporated in the plan, and they'll be incorporated into the code, the same diagrams. So they would provide some level of guidance on scale and form beyond that which is written in the paragraphs that you're looking at. So, Dan, you might be right. That corridor maybe doesn't exist in the town. It certainly might at UB, but perhaps not on some of the corridors. It's there to kind of indicate that there would be a diagram there that would be suggestive of what those might look like. So, the diagrams on page 38, one more note on that. The diagram, the photo that's used for the medium scale node happens to be the Maple and North Forest intersection, which is not a medium scale node. We haven't designated it as such, so what we probably would do is change that diagram to the Gettsville area, as that would be representative of a medium scale node. So just know that photo would change as well. So, any other thoughts on this, or the discussion we had about height? Gary, you had mentioned something about 5 stories for corridors. I think Lee responded to your question. I don't know if that response was adequate.
My notes showed 5 and then 6, which is why I asked tonight how we got to 8.
For center? I thought your comment dealt with
corridor?
Yeah, thought that was more with the corridor.
That was...
Where is that? That might be on the next...
I had suggested 4 last time,
Okay.
and it's still 2 to 5.
And it's
I was
5,
the only one
yeah.
thinking like that.
And I think what he said was, and I guess this is another thing to keep in mind, I know he said this before, it's likely that for each one of these types, there may be more than one zoning district. So, and I think that's what he was alluding to here, that, you know, for certain corridors and certain places, and we had this conversation earlier this week at Amherst Middle School with respect to Sheridan Drive, where many of you who went on the tours with us last year would have observed that, and Frank is well aware of this, in that corridor you've got fairly deep parcels, like the Walmart parcel and the plaza at Sweet Home and Sheridan, and then directly across the street you have parcels that are very shallow. And the same district may not do justice to those differences in patterns of development, so that's an area that would probably be one that you'd see 2 different districts prepared for that certain circumstance, if that makes sense. So, and that was your comment on page 39. You're okay with that?
Yes.
Resolution to that?
Yes.
Again, are folks generally comfortable with the height situation being written in here? Have we come to some conclusion on that? Is that still unsettled? Without taking a vote, I suppose. I know, Dave, you may still have some reservations about that. If not, I'm gonna move on. Okay. We're okay with the idea of putting these graphics in that are suggestive of the form and types of development?
If we could say, you know, identify what it's representative of. You know,
Sure.
So
Well, I'll go one step further. In talking with him this afternoon, he would actually like you to suggest examples of places that would fit each one of these typologies. So that's something we can do maybe over the course of the next month. If you can, just keep in mind this question: what would be the areas that would be representative of each one of these combinations of form and type? So there would be 8. And if you have any recommendations as to what areas they should use to model, and these will be drawings, but they'll use those as models to base the concepts on. So if you have any thoughts on that, please let Kim and I know.
In regards to corridor, it seems like Niagara Falls Boulevard and Transit Road headquarters, and since they are on town lines, how can we do this with both sides of the street if the other side of the street's another town?
No, if what someone's proposing in the town, matches the general corridor here, the orientation doesn't matter.
Are you suggesting that our types of development ought to
Take into account what's going on across the street.
Or not use Transit or Niagara Falls Boulevard as an example.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay.
just want to direct Tonawanda and Clarence to our way of thinking?
Yeah.
We should declare war on Tonawanda.
I don't know, yeah. They probably have a different thoughts on that. Okay.
It was a joke, for the record. That was a joke.
Okay. Protect yourself, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go to, I'm on page 3 of your comments. The next set of comments that the committee had to do with some of the specific areas, what are now called special use areas. And, the discussion for that, where does that begin? Well, I wanna back up. We're gonna start with Cross Point, which I think is maybe on page 42, and I apologize, my eyes, no, my eyes are not working too well. That's the map, that's right. And the discussion last time was what that ought to be. That was changed to reflect what the committee wanted to change it to, the suburban medium scale node. Everybody sees that, we're all good with that, right? Just want to confirm that.
Of course, Carl's not here, so, you know, we can't get his input on it.
That's true that, but he was here last month when we voted on it, so. Okay, so having said that, we're gonna go to page 55, which I believe starts the conversation, I hope, about the specific descriptions of the special use centers. So the committee last month decided that it wanted to call these out separately, and although they may not have specific form and type specified or designated, we have descriptions of each one of those to try and provide some guidance. This is the guidance that's there, and I guess I would ask if folks are generally comfortable with that. I guess we'll start with Norrisport, Smith, and New, and the description there. Because that was one that we spent a fair bit of time talking about.
I wonder if we could back up to the University East Center on page 54.
Okay.
Maybe it's covered by this already, but under technology, research, and development functions, but the university is primarily a research institution and is expanding a lot in the areas of nanotechnology, material science, that type of thing. And often universities that have that kind of work going on have spin-off companies that surround them. So I'm wondering if we're taking into account that might be a thing that people would request to do in the future. Am I making this clear? Does everybody understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah. I guess my question back to you is, did you read through this? I mean, is it strong enough to emphasize that point?
Honestly, I didn't get to this page.
Okay.
But it does mention technology, research, and development functions. What do we have for this as, in terms of building sizes and so on? What would it be classified as?
Those would probably fall into our business park and office park designations, which we're not necessarily addressing in this project. As Rick mentioned, hopefully we'll be dealing with that in the not too distant future. Go ahead. You're concerned that
I'm not endorsing the idea that it should be a big high-rise place or anything like that. I'm just saying this is something that will probably be a thing that people will request to do down the road, so we should anticipate that.
The one thing to keep in mind is, of course, it's on the university property, and we don't have a lot to say about what happens on that property. We can suggest things, which is what we've done here, but we're not able to zone it either.
Of course, I'm thinking of what's sprung up around other large university campuses.
Right, and so on the lands that are privately owned, we can certainly provide guidance for those.
On this center, the University East, I'm not sure where the bullets came from, but most of them are non-commercial. Even if there was research and development or more industrial, it all makes sense. But the hotel and other commercial uses typically found in the community center is, of all the university property and all the property surrounding the university, is this a good location for hotels and other commercial uses? Can we strike? I know we don't have the teeth, but can we strike that bullet? So it's not aspirational in our plan?
I will tell you that this language is almost exactly the language that's in the plan today. So that's where these came from, if you're asking. And then, so the other, your question, I guess, is one to put to the committee, I suppose, is whether or not, it should remain in there or not.
I do a hotel in there.
Because it's good,
It's located adjacent to a university, near an interchange. I mean, it has commercial characteristics. I mean, I can see them doing R&D, and I can see it having a lot of things. It's a sprawling piece of property. So you'd probably create a main intersection to the campus, a connection there. You probably want to, that'd be the valuable property that would connect that property across Milford Highway to the campus. So you'd probably want to do something on either side of that. And the rest of it could kind of scale down, but I don't know why you'd want to limit that. It's insulated from residential. Why wouldn't you want to do it there versus other
Is
places?
it insulated from residential? I guess there's a lot of buffer to residential, but that side of campus is more residential than
Well, that's Barry's
the Sweet Home
Golf
side.
Course. It's pretty insulated from residential.
Yeah, well, that area, of course, is undeveloped today. So there's not much, there's nothing on that property, and it is surrounded by the bike path and the diversion channel. So, you know, what's the pleasure? I mean, is that something we want to strike from there, or folks okay with that? It's been in there for a while, so.
Yeah, I think, just to be on a different part of it, this is almost an area where I could see a taller building going in. I mean, you're talking a hotel, but you've got all of the tall buildings of the university, and then you've got quite a distance from, especially from Millersport, east, till you hit anything that's residential or would be impacted by a taller building. So, to try and limit this to keep it real low scale, I don't know, is it's really...
A six-story building on this property would almost look flat because of the size of because of its context.
Knowing now that this language is already in the plan, and considering that we really can't force the university in what they do, I'll drop my suggestion.
Okay, so that was one of the comments that the committee made last month. Let me jump back to the Millersport Smith and New, where I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we were not going to provide a whole lot of guidance to this area, and I believe,
Well, you can guess what my comments are going to be here for this area. It's, talking about a village center over on page 55. Has significant potential to develop as a more diversified village center comprised of smaller scale mixed and residential and commercial uses. Again, Ransom Creek is right there, and I've seen that intersection of that land under deeper water. So I have concerns about trying to build a village center there.
So, we chose not to specify a form and type for this, at the last meeting, or a general location where that what commercial development occurred as part of this would be encouraged to take place. So, I guess I want to make sure, do we want to specify a form and type based on Ramona's comment, which would provide some guidance as to the scale of this, or do we want to just leave it the way it is? And Ramona, would you recommend that we take some of the language out? I think that's what I heard you say, so, go ahead.
I did want to mention that this is one of the most unusual properties we have to deal with when we're doing the comprehensive plan. I believe it was originally designated as being shopping center at one point in time. This is part of the Ransom Oaks plan, and we went through the comprehensive plan. The TND district was the one that was, and actually that came after the plan was adopted, was the one that was most appropriate for, I'll say, downzoning the property. And I think the description that Lee has put together is a reflection of what that TND district calls for in terms of mixes of uses, and I believe that that's what's really driving the description. I have to say that I'm somewhat uncomfortable about the proposal for the land, this particular parcel and what the land use is, being so far out in our, what I'll call the suburban fabric. I'm not sure that we're in a very good position to make a real good recommendation as to what we should do with the property within the context of the project that we're doing right now. To me, the reason why we're considering it is because under the TND district, there's a requirement for a commercial component, and I think that's how it got to be part of this exercise. But this is an extremely difficult one, probably the most difficult one we have to deal with.
And this language is the language that exists in the plan today. And as Ramona was reading it, some of these terms are probably not terms that we should maintain because we no longer use some of the terminology here. Urban village is a term that we use in the plan now to describe the nature of that development. It could be changed. Rick, is it the TND is it 15%? Maximum is 15% commercial.
You know, Dan, I'm not that. I can't recite that part of the code. That sounds really familiar. But again, I really don't want to go on record saying 15% for commercial, but I can say categorically there's a requirement for a certain percentage in commercial use, yes. Yeah, and that's why it was originally considered.
Right.
To me, you know, I think that we should, the description of this should be as low scale, low intensity as possible.
Along those lines, oh, sorry. May I?
No, he checked to see that that's the one that's acting off your tape. Yeah, it's
not happening.
You hit it.
Along those lines, the last sentence is kind of mystifying to me as to what that even means. This area is designated to become one of the town's most significant and scenic gateways, marking the transition. What does that even mean? A gateway to what?
To rural. So transition from suburban to rural. Right. You're leaving the more single-family residential development areas to the lower density area.
Was essentially rural.
Okay. I think it's a little overblown, as, you know, with Rick saying we should keep this kind of low-key. I mean,
the other thing is a consideration, I hope this doesn't confuse it, is that there's a sewer district boundary runs right through this area. So the area south of this is in a sewer district and is subject to more intensive development. The area to the north on that side of Millersport Highway is not within the sewer district, and that would be the area where we focus on, number one, preserving agriculture and having rural residential uses and very little commercial uses, if any. And then the other thing, the plan actually recommends that the area on the east side of Millersport Highway, north of Dockside Village, that also be in those very low-intensity uses. That's in fairly close proximity to this site.
I think one of the items in here that it bothers me is that I keep saying it should have this, should have that, as you go through, and I liked Rick's verbiage a little earlier about it should be low intensity, I believe you said, in this area, and maybe it ought to be written more that way, that this is a low intense area that could include, and then list the different items that are listed in here. And so it's sort of setting a design parameter rather than a demand.
So, Duncan, in response to that, Dan, just give me a moment. The terminology that you see here, so commercial use is typical of a neighborhood, urban village center, neighborhood serving cluster of retail. Recall from the current plan that these terms like neighborhood, community, regional, traditional are used to describe a certain scale of center. So that's where these terms come from. They are intentional. They refer to specific scales identified in the plan. Now those scales are coming out, so some of these terms may not be appropriate anymore. And I guess this point, from what I'm hearing, it probably needs a little bit more wordsmithing. But are you suggesting that we would recommend a form and type for this based on the typology that we've had, which is not something we've wanted to do? We've had this conversation several times. Not something we want to do, or we try and come up with some terms that are maybe not directly related to the typology here, but get to the gist of the lower intensity kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. I'm trying to get rid of words like shall, because I think those are, to me, that's demanding. This is what you're gonna do. But if you say, here's what we'd like to see done, and make it softer, and then just leave it to whoever wants to have the property and what they want to put on it, as long as it's in the low scale, as you've said, that it needs to be.
It's my understanding most of this language is already in the comp plan, correct? What if we were to leave it somewhat ambiguous? I mean, if we were to look at the top of page 355, the fourth sentence down at the beginning of however, strike all the language from however to the third last sentence of that paragraph to creek, and then, leave the last two sentences. This area is also destined to become one of the town's most significant scenic gateways, marking a transition from suburban to rural Amherst. Leave it somewhat ambiguous. We're defining it that we gave some historical context of where it is now from what it was, a large area designated for retail, but leave it ambiguous. We're struggling with what to do with it, but it still gives it some descriptive characteristics of where it is and what it is as a center. Just a suggestion.
I guess I disagree and think it may be more beneficial to identify the types of uses that the plan anticipates for that area. I don't think the problem is how specific that sentence is with all the types of uses. I think the problem is using the terminology, the urban village center terminology from the older version of the plan, which is no longer going to be relevant.
Gary, when you say uses, are you talking of specific uses, or are you talking about form and?
Uses, there's
uses
listed here. Service, retail service, office, recreation uses. We list some examples of uses that would be expected in this part of the T&D.
I guess my direction was, what I'm suggesting is that there appears to be a consensus that we don't want to promote the development of this area as an intense area. We recognize the environmental constraints, that it's the transition from a suburban area to a rural characteristic, and I guess if we don't describe it, then we're not promoting it as an intensive use. We could, try to suggest that we want it to remain in its rural character as a small node. I don't know. I thought that's what that was the topology we had suggested. This was going to be a small node, this area.
You mean a low-scale node or a small node?
A low-scale node.
So now, I just want to be clear. So now we're going back, and I'm not being argumentative. Now we're going back to introducing a form and type to this description, and that's what I want to get clear on, because that there was quite a bit of discussion about that the last time. If we're suggesting here that what development occurs is consistent with the form and type of a low-scale node, is that what you're saying? I mean, is that going to be satisfactory?
I would favor that. I mean, if something then comes before the planning board in the future, then we have an idea of what we're describing for this area.
Yeah, I have to kind of reverse my position, the position we talked about earlier, at least you and I. I think as a compromise, what Dan Ulatowski is talking about would probably be the best we could do at the point in time. The one thing that we're, to a large degree, we're struggling with here is the history of that property. So I think that for this current effort, that would probably be, Dan's suggestion would probably be a very good compromise.
I'm receptive. So as before. I'm receptive to that in maybe dementia setting, but I thought when we put this in the special activity center category because there was reasons why we were reticent to try and be really specific what we wanted there. So if we're going to get specific, does it still remain a special activity center, or do we reclassify it on the map again? I feel like we're kind of going back, and maybe that's okay, I just want to make sure I didn't lose something along the way.
We did take it out at one point. We entirely removed it, and then at our last meeting, we had some reservations of entirely eliminating it from the map because of its history and its litigious history.
Well, again, I'm going to say, it's not just the history. It exists today, Zone TND. There is a commercial component to that. The question is whether or not you want to suggest what the form and type of that commercial development ought to be, as you do on several other centers throughout town. So, we can not include that, or we can. Am I hearing that folks are comfortable with characterizing it, rather than maybe we'll try and figure out a way to wordsmith, explicitly saying it has to be a low-scale node, maybe its form and scale of development there is, not consistent with, but, representative of a low-scale node. We'll figure out some way to wordsmith that.
Which is surrounded or developed in tandem with the residential development, because this is only part of the land. So it would be less intensive service, commercial service, retail.
Oriented to that transition.
Oriented to...
Transition is discussed in the last sentence, is the recommendation. Okay?
Let's come to a conclusion on this. All in favor of classifying this as a low-scale node, please put up your hand. As opposed to allowing to remain in a special category. No, it's in as a special category now. Take it out of the special.
Last time I realized it was taken out, and then when I read this, it was put
Right,
back
because
in.
last month, we put it back in.
That's what I get for missing the meeting.
But we put it in as a special, right, so now instead of it being special...
Well, could I just share this picture with everybody before they vote?
No,
This is from 1985, and I'll be glad to pass it around. That's why I'm so passionate about this area. And this... That's right. It was...
Low draft.
And this is before the other side of Ransom Oaks was built, and Dockside was built, and all that area was used as flood storage. And this is what Millersport and Smith looked like, too. It was all underwater. And I don't think things have gotten any better since then. So it's, who wants to build at Millersport? I know I live in a home, and every winter we hold our breath, that this isn't going to happen again, like Russian roulette.
Dale, I think what we were talking about was not putting it back in as one of the centers, but just describing the types of uses that would be here would be equivalent to what would be in a low-scale node that would serve the surrounding residential area.
Less intensive.
Was that your intent, Dan?
I don't know anymore, because
Yeah, I'm confused
at our
too.
last meeting, it was somewhat impressed upon us that we have to put it back in.
That was my impression,
Right.
too.
And we went round and round, and I even said, well, why do we even have to put it back in? So, and then we looked at all the other areas.
Not in as a center. It's there as a special use
Right, we
center.
recategorized it.
Right.
Which is less intensive.
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah.
serves what Ramona's getting at, is what we're talking about it here as a special center is less intensive than all the other mixed-use centers we've been talking about.
And I would like to somehow give it some description that's representative of what we desire it to be, and I think we all agree we want it to be illustrative of a low-scale node that respects that transition going into the rural area. So however we can describe it that way, I think it's important to make that description.
Try and get our best wordsmith on that one.
Right, so what you're saying is change the verbiage to be reflective of a low-scale node without making it a low-scale node? Right, okay. All right. So we're going to ask Lee to do that.
Okay, the last one was Muir Woods, and Again, it's designated now as a special use center. In here, there was added, we added this for discussion, okay, center development on the site, could feature traditional suburban forms of medium or low-scale nodes. Do you want to do the same thing with this that you're talking about doing with Millersport, Smith, and New, or do you just want to leave out any discussion whatsoever about the scale, understanding that there are commercial components to this site?
Well, first of all, I have a problem with development plans for this area having included single, et cetera, et cetera. We have no idea where it's going to go. At this point, it's in a state of flux. So why should we even consider anything in here as a descriptive of what we think what the development is going to be? That makes no sense to me at all. I think that whole sentence that goes from development down to Audubon intersection needs to be taken out.
What about the last sentence? That's the one.
That's just citing the potential could be, it's not citing any absolutes.
The other thing I guess I would suggest is, so we had this conversation last time too, and there was discussion about whether we should be telling folks what that ought to be, or, and I think one might argue that is in fact what, not telling them what it ought to be, but we're expressing what the town's vision for that area is. So I don't know if that contradicts what you're saying or not, but that's, here you're trying to express what the town's vision for that particular area might be. And the idea here would be that to introduce some notion of scale to that. It's very similar to the discussion we just had about Millersport, Smith and New, where we don't know exactly what's going to go there, but if something does occur there, it ought to have taken into consideration these kinds of factors and have some scale to it.
But that's what the last sentence does.
Yep, you're good with that.
Yeah.
I did have a different spin on this. So if you go back to what a special use center is defined as, it's a mix of ancillary uses related to a major civic or institutional presence. So one would presume that this site is related to UB. So if that's the definition of a center, regardless of what you say here, and I'm coming to you as the owner of Muir Woods, and I'm not, by the way, I say, well, I want to do student housing here, because it's a complementary use to the civic center that I'm associated with. That's how you define this center, regardless of what you've described in here. So I think I was okay with putting this in the special activity center, because we weren't sure what to do with it last month, but when I saw it in the context of how it was written here, special activity center or use center was defined, I started scratching my head saying, gee, I don't know anymore, because it's in here because it has a relationship that's the definition of special use center that almost, to me, supersedes what we describe it to be. You can't just ignore the fact that on one hand it says that it's got to be this, it's got to be ancillary uses, on the other hand it's saying, well, you can't do that. It just seemed kind of weird. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure that today that property really, notwithstanding its proximity to UB, really would be developed with any relationship to UB. That was the original plan. But now, with the proposal to kind of do a lot of single family there, it's only a special use center by proximity. I don't know if it's really as tight as we want it to be. But if you make that linkage, I'm thinking, oh, I could do student housing here because that's rated UB. I offer that because it's just a different perspective when I saw it in the context of the narrative.
Well, should we modify the language at the front of the section? So now I found it. I'm having trouble seeing here. Millard Fillmore Suburban Hospital is kind of the classic special use center, right? It has a certain characteristics about it that you would associate with the institution and the uses that might evolve around it. So should we think about changing the definition of special use center? We wouldn't necessarily have to lose that institutional link, because it doesn't apply to all these. It would apply to Millard Fillmore, and it does certainly apply to the John James Audubon area, which trying to see whether we left that in here or not. I thought we did.
I mean, I actually liked the definition of special use center. It was very, it was relevant, and if I looked at Suburban Hospital, and I even looked at John James Audubon Parkway, the municipal complex there was a relevancy to its definition with some of the ones that were there. Where I started to scratch my head is when I got to Muir Woods, saying, okay, what's the relevancy of that to a civic use or whatever? Well, I guess it's got to be UB.
It's a good point.
But then that might mean something different for how somebody else would interpret this. But
Well, but
again, I always look at this agreement with what the intent is, but then with how it's being read, how it may get used or interpreted by others. And I think there's some opportunity here to create some real conflict.
Well, but to your point, if the developer Muir Woods decides to make it single-family homes or even townhouses or whatever, it just becomes typical suburban. It has nothing to do with, so why is it special use? I would think we should take it out. I think we should take Muir Woods out.
That may be a better solution than trying to redefine special use center, which I think, as it's defined, is actually a pretty good definition. And if you look at the other ones that are here, you can say, well, yeah, I get that, yeah.
Let me ask the question. Keep it in, take it out. Out. Majority of people take it out, okay.
Oh, come on.
Get that on the record.
All right. Again, there's a note in our notes that says that special use centers will be designated on Figure 6. They are. Those are the light pink areas. Obviously, Muir Woods will come out of there. Now it'll be left to the planning department to decide what it is or how it's designated on the map. So we'll figure that out. But that introduces a change to Figure 6 that, so let me just be clear on this. Your recommendation is to take it out as a special use center. I don't know if this is appropriate to look for uses that might be suggested there from this committee, or we'll just come up with a staff recommendation, but that is going to alter Figure 6.
The owner of the property and went through a process where the Audubon plan was amended, and now there's actually four different pods with different descriptions, and then we can go back to those descriptions which are in the I think it's in the finding statement of the environmental impact statement, isn't it, David?
Yeah, he's not. Yeah. So if folks want to look at page 3-30, which is Figure 6, the colored map. 3-30, I think. Yeah, my eyes are. You're not going to trust anything I say, are you? Everyone's familiar with Muir Woods, with where Muir Woods is. If you look at that little 990 symbol in the northwestern part of the map, you'll see those three light pink areas. So those three pink areas would have to change to a different designation that, as Rick is suggesting, would be reflective of what the current plans call for in the amendment to the NCD, right? Okay. And if I'm not mistaken, then I could very well be the easternmost one is primarily single-family residential.
That's correct.
The one at the terminus of the 990.
It's kind of split in half. Most of that is for multifamily housing, not necessarily student housing, but multifamily housing. And then everything on the
west side.
The west side would be, I believe I have this correct, would be office uses.
Yeah.
And the ones all the way over against, between Dodge Road and Sweet Home Road would be R&D.
So those would be the colors, so you'd be a gray, kind of some form of yellow in the center, and then a single family or light yellow on the right.
That makes sense.
Good. All right. Okay. So those are the comments that we addressed from the last meeting. It's taken us a while to get through those. Is there anything we're missing from the last meeting that we haven't discussed here? Anybody have any other thoughts from the last meeting that we haven't talked about? If not, okay, let's proceed.
Is it, if I go through this weekend and prepare some comments, I don't know if we can get a Word file, so it's easier for you to insert comments. Is it something I can do and get to you early next week?
let's hold a thought on that,
Okay.
okay? Because now I'm gonna...
Otherwise, we gotta be here for another 4.
This is gonna seem inefficient, but this is the way we decided to go through this. So I want to go back, all the way back to page 1 again. And we're just I'm gonna walk through this. Where we had comments from the public over the last couple of weeks, I'll try and identify those as we go through those, see whether there's changes that need to be made and how we might want to handle those. And then, anybody that has any comments along the way that you've noted and want to discuss, feel free to bring those up as we walk through the document, okay? This is from the public meeting, so there's a page that looks like this, that came in your packet, and then there were 3 or 4 pages that look like this, which had comments, written public comments on them. So we'll try and, I'll highlight those as we go through the document, and we can talk a little bit about those. So, yeah. I believe the first, and this may jump around, I apologize for that, but the first comment had to do with the edges of the village. So on page 42, if we might, that's the map. I just want to make sure that you feel as if we're addressing this comment. The gentleman that made the comment just wanted to ensure that the edges of the village should be consistent with the village in form and height, because he considered it to be an extension. You've identified the edges as having a traditional form, and there's some variation as to whether it's a medium scale or a low scale node. Is there anything in that comment that would compel you to change that?
You said traditional.
Yes, so we're comfortable with that? Okay. The next comment down was made up at Transit Road Middle School, husband and wife that were there, and their comments primarily related to noise along the Transit Road corridor. I don't think there's much we can do in the plan to address these comments directly. However, there's certainly some things that we can ask the consultant to consider to respond to these when he does the changes to the zoning ordinance to try and address noise based on his experiences otherwise. There's some provisions in the code that deal with noise now. We'll see if there's some other things that he has that may address these, but this would be dealt with in the zoning. Is there anybody that has any objection to that? Okay. The next few comments had to deal with, as I interpreted them, different options for parking, and the actual getting back to the height situation. So I'm going to go to page 3-10. I think that's where I picked it up the first time. This is a discussion about design and placement of land use transition, so the parking behind and the transition there between the parking and the surrounding areas. And then the next comment really had to do with the differences between 2 and 3 stories and how it looks from the residential areas. So both of these I felt were really more transitional questions than anything else. I think the person was looking to add a statement to bring attention to consideration for both sides of the property. We tend to focus a lot of attention on the way it looks from the street. His suggestion was that we maybe wanted to provide a statement in here that says that the form and scale and the way this thing plays out on the backside might be as important as how it plays out on the front side. And this included an interesting comment that had to do with the mechanicals that go on top of the buildings, that they may not always be screened all the way around. I think that's what you had observed. So that there maybe ought to be more attention paid to the screening of those all the way around the mechanical area when there's a residential area there. So what we would propose to do here is to add a statement that would try and address that comment. Looking at things, considering both perspectives, the front and the rear, when they're looking at design.
Dan, I think it should incorporate all 4 sides of the building, if it's, there are many places in town now that where some of the outbuildings go up, there's a lot of work done to try and get those looking good, because you're approaching them two sides, a lot of times they're on a corner, so you've got two sides there, and then the parking is all on what we call the back, because it's away from the street. So you want to, I think we should encourage proper design of all four sides, and that would include screening of equipment, et cetera.
Okay. All right, so we'll try and, actually, if you've got any suggested language for that, you know, you got my email address. If you got any thoughts on it, please share it with us. Okay, so I'm back on page 3-10. Is there anybody have any comments or thoughts on any of the changes that are suggested between pages 1 and 10 that we haven't discussed already? Okay. So I'm going to kind of march through this. My next stop is probably going to be, and I can't guarantee I'm not going to go back, but 339 would be my next stop. So let's just kind of walk through here. Anything on any of these pages up to page 39 that anybody has comments on or thoughts on? That gets us into the diagrams, which we talked about already. I think the big one here is the notion of stories and feet, and how we refer to height. So we want to come to some conclusion here. Lee's suggestion is that we stick with stories in the plan, and that that he will specify both stories and feet in the zoning code.
There was an interesting comment made the other night. If you specify 2 stories, and one of the stories ends up being not typical, it could dramatically affect the height of the building. What's a typical story, David, on a commercial site? Retail.
The floor to ceiling area, the minimum is probably 14 feet, that's the minimum. But if you look at what's happening now, retail, the facade of that building's got a giant false forehead that could be upwards of 20 or 22 feet, just to kind of create more of a street presence or to create the illusion of multi-story. But from a retailer's perspective, they generally need a minimum of 14 feet for a typical village style. Now, Transit Road might be different, but minimum of 14 feet. And then that means the overall building is probably taller than that if it's single story.
How about if it were an office space?
Once again, from floor to floor, you're probably, right now, office heights for ceilings, or ceilings for offices are getting taller than shorter. There's nothing that makes the office building more obsolete than short ceilings, because now you have more open space and co-working space that are wide open. So in order to make those floors seem taller, you have to go taller, so like 9.5 to 10 feet is a typical finished ceiling height, which means that you got another 4 feet of structure before that, so you're probably about 14 feet to be safe, floor to floor. And once again, usually the first floor is a little taller just because you're trying to create some pizzazz.
But typically they're around the same. There's not a lot of variance between the two at this point.
Correct. On the exterior there would be, so retail is
Right.
obviously looking to kind of create more of a street presence and more of a sign that's...
Yeah, so like the new building that Ben's is putting up on Transit Road on the
yeah.
far side.
Yeah.
That's only 1 story, but it looks like it's about 3.
Right, so it's,
Yeah, right.
it's
I don't know how you address this concern. I think it's a legitimate concern, but it depends upon what's being developed and who the developer is and the design of the building.
yeah, so if I do, hotel or apartments over retail, well, that first floor is going to be pretty tall. The next 2 floors might be smaller.
So is the potential there that if you did something like that and it were that tall, could the actual height of the 2 stories be equivalent to currently could be 3 stories?
Yes, and the other concern is, so you can't take architecture out of this. So, I have to stare every day across the street at the Wyndham. It's there. And I understood the economics of what Ellicott had to deal with on that site, because they spent $3.7 billion to acquire that property, so they had to get as much in as they could. And if they had a little more room with height, they probably would have put a proper top or a crown on that building, but they tried to squeeze as much as they could in within the height limit they had, and I think architecturally would all have been happy with the building if they could have finished off the top of it with a proper crown. So, once again, when you start compressing height limits, you're compressing the ability of the owner or developer of that property to do something proper architecturally, because at the end of the day, they have to make the numbers work, and sometimes that means you can't finish the architecture of the building. So, and of course then, you have the avenue for variances for that kind of stuff, but once again, that's what makes it challenging when you start to get too limiting, and that's why if I probably comment too much about kind of leaving here with the echo of building height in my head, it's because there's so much more to resolving how you make buildings appropriate and how you finish them to make them look appropriate, and it's not just about their height, but that seems to be what's easy for people to kind of grab onto.
And including the screening of mechanicals, too.
I think we should not overly focus in on height and stories at this point in time, because we also have to look at the ratio of the building height to the road. I mean, it depends how wide the public space is, too, when you look at height and scale.
And distance.
And we might want to have an aesthetic appeal where it might resemble a second story, but not actually be a functional second story, much like you have on Main Street at the Walgreens. It's a one-story building, but it's reflective of a two-story building, and it really affects the appearance. And it's desirable. I mean, it could. So I don't want to overly emphasize stories and height at this point. I think we have to look at all the other elements of scale and design.
And ironically, so the flip side of that, so in the village had passed their new plan, which required a minimum of 2 stories and up. So we bought this little tiny property next to the Williamsville Towers, and I don't have a lot of room for parking or anything, so we're saying, well, I know you just passed this new plan, but if I do 2 stories, I'm going to fail because I can't get enough parking on the property to support 2 stories. So we were encouraged to make a very tall 1-story building that almost look like 2 stories, where most other towns don't want you to. They don't want to have that kind of tall for it. We were kind of encouraged to do it because we were getting a variance to go from 2-story to 1-story. I mean, what do you think of that, right? So it's kind of weird. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule, I guess.
Well, I think one of the issues that I was mentioning it earlier, and you talk about building heights, we're concentrating here, on commercial, but if you take, one of the concerns is it's residential housing that's next door to these things. Well, if you build a new house today, it's going to be 2 stories with a pitched roof, which in essence is a 3-story building. It aesthetically seems to, because of the pitch of the roof, but we're in a lot of places here, we're sort of saying you can't build a commercial building as big as you would a residential building, because this is what we're trying to enforce here by stating stories or feet. So I think we have to get into the whole gamut of from the architectural standpoint or visual standpoint of the buildings.
Gary, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I don't remember who asked the question, Dale or Dan, but I think the plan could talk to height, could talk to stories, but really it's going to get worked out in the zoning. All the things that Dave just said should be addressed in the zoning, but not necessarily in the plan.
I think that was Lee's point. Let me just relay. We had a conversation about this with him this afternoon, and I will not do this justice, I'm sure. So I'm going to ask him to chime in if I miss something. But his comments were this. He said, the committee and the town seems to be working toward encouraging a mixed-use floor development, which typically ends up with a taller ground floor. And I'm going to look to you to say yea or nay, I suppose, on that. But that was one of his comments.
Sorry, I was still reading ahead.
So his comment was that as the community is working toward trying to encourage mixed-use forms of development, you're typically finding that the first floor of a mixed-use building is taller than others. And you're also working toward encouraging higher quality types of development. So he really thinks we'd be better off in the plan to stay with the notion of stories and leave it somewhat, open as to the footage, is the interpretation of the building. It's gonna vary, as David's suggesting, depending on its use. And he notes that the code will specify height in feet and probably stories as well. So I don't know if that kind of piggybacks on what Gary just said, but, go ahead, Ramona.
I think it was Dan that was mentioning about design, and so it's David, that, I'm not sure if I'm using the right term, but it seems like I saw the word, is it step back? Or about is would a term like that be in the code?
Yes. Yes.
It's already in,
It's in the plan.
I read it someplace there, I wasn't sure.
It is. Yep.
Already in, so that seems to be more agreeable to people when it doesn't seem so overpowering.
Yeah, I think one of the sections he added here was a discussion about ways of kind of mitigating the height with the step back and then the articulation of the building and those kinds of things. So the fundamental question here is, are we okay with specifying height here in terms of stories? That was the public comment. There was some desire to think about feet, but again, I think Lee's recommendation would be to stay with stories. That there'll be specification of feet in the code. Go ahead, Gary, any thoughts on this?
I was just going to say yes, as long as we get to stories and feet in the code.
That's what he says he's going to do. So.
Dan?
Yep.
When you said before we got to whatever page you're on, 338.
Yep.
If we had anything else on 327, going back a bit, there is one addition about the expansion of existing zoning districts. This is one thing that we talked about at the meeting Tuesday night.
Yep.
I'm wondering if we could strengthen that even a little farther. The point I'm trying to make is, should we add something that tries to discourage the expansion of commercial, expansion by commercial by acquiring single-family residences and knocking them down and converting them to commercial? I think it goes to changing the character of the surrounding neighborhood.
Okay, I'm going to open that one up for conversation.
I wouldn't want to agree to that. I think there are applications within the town where that might be perfectly appropriate, and you might be depriving a homeowner from an exit strategy on a home that might otherwise be unattractive to sell. So to try and put it in there as a general rule and then make that very difficult to do, I think it could be harmful, especially in the older parts of the town where you're trying to develop or commercial development's already there against some of these houses. It may be the perfect thing to do to accumulate some of these homes and make a larger parcel and do something proper with, as long as you properly treat the homes that are remaining. In other applications, it may not be appropriate, but I'd be concerned about having a general rule in there.
Maybe it could be tied to the different types of mixed-use centers. What I'm thinking is a traditional node where we got a couple small stores and then houses, and it all works because it's close to the street, it's walkable, it's a village setting, as opposed to a corridor or a center where no one wants to live next to it, and that house is not going to get sold for a house, and it's better commercial. Maybe we can consider it as it's related to, that kind of expansion as it's related to the nodes.
Gary, let me ask you a question. If that were to occur, and a developer were to buy property that was currently zoned residential, that would have to be rezoning, would it not?
Correct, and that's why I want the code to give some guidance. That's plan.
Wouldn't that be more appropriate at the time when it would go before the ZBA, or would it go before the town board?
The town board, in addressing zoning changes, should use this document as their guide.
Yeah, but to David's point, and I have to agree with them, there are certain parcels of land in Amherst at this point, that probably, and I'm thinking of a couple off the top of my head, that probably it would be a benefit to the homeowner if they would sell it and let it be commercial.
Which is why I said maybe for the expansion of traditional nodes.
I'm reading 327 that we should discourage the creation of new zoning districts, not the expansion of existing commercial centers, et cetera.
Look at page 344. The bottom of page 344. And maybe that addresses your maybe. Say. It does not get specific about single family, I don't think.
Yeah, I have a comment on that page because I want to take out the last three words. It says, if at all. Once again, the whole point there being, I know what the intention is, we're trying to discourage this, but when you put in words like if at all, you almost make it impossible for it to occur. If that's the intent, then so be it. I would object to it. But if you're saying, I'm always concerned about absolutes because it's a big town, and you're talking about 10 or 15 years, and there's going to be scenarios where this is appropriate, and to have to put somebody through the rigmarole of having to go through everything and have to deal with languaging that seems so finite, which I don't think is the intent, is kind of scary. So I understand the intent, I just want to make sure I think I understand the intent, but the words seem to go a little further than I think the intent intends. Not consistent with this. The other paragraph was fine, says it should be limited.
Yeah.
Well, that's, I think, a very clear message. Saying if at all is basically saying should never happen.
Okay, so hold that thought. Gary, does this address your comment?
Yes, more so than the other page.
Okay, so it's here, it's okay here. Okay, so, all right. So while we're here, on page 44, any thoughts on Dave's comment related to this section? And Dave, you're suggesting that the term, or the phrase, if at all, be dropped from that second sentence, is that what I understand?
It's a general comment, because this provision appears several times in here, similar language. I understand and accept that what we're trying to do here is limit either expansion or additions of new centers. And I like the word limit. I think that message is clear. That puts the burden on the applicant to say that this is a special case. But I'm just trying to move off from something that kind of gets interpreted or could be interpreted to be a finite statement. So in this case, it's if at all. My case is where the 3 or 4 times this appears, just say limited or discouraged.
Strike if at all. I mean, should occur rarely, period.
Everybody agree to that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, Gary, you got me. We went backwards, right? That's okay. The next comment is this more comments related to building height for low-scale nodes. Proposed 3 stories should be close to the street. This gets to maybe a little bit to Ramona's comment a moment ago about the step back. The suggestion here was to put the step back in the back of the building as opposed to the front of the building, so the impact on the surrounding residential areas was mitigated. Any thoughts on that?
I like the idea. You don't really see the step back when you're driving down the corridor. What I like about these 2 illustrations is what the point I was trying to make earlier, when it really makes a difference on how much public space there is, or even if it's semi-public. I find this corridor very appealing because there's breaks in the building being pushed back that creates some semi-public space here.
Okay. Now, their comment related to step backs. Yeah, okay.
But I like the idea of introducing the step back on the back side of the Station residential, because I think when you're at a second-story residence looking at an adjacent commercial, there's more of a benefit than seeing it traveling down the corridor.
Is it possible that one would get a step back on the front and back of the building?
It's, once again, case by case. If you get to a point, every use has a functional depth and width So if you're in a hotel, you gotta have a minimum of 66 feet. If you're doing apartments, it's a little bit wider than that. So everything's got its functional depth, so depending on the step back requirements, you get to a point where you make that additional story infeasible or unfeasible, non-feasible, whatever the word is. And, you know, that becomes a problem. And once again, so you're creating a smaller area, but still has almost the same amount of perimeter footprint, so that floor becomes extraordinarily expensive on a per square foot basis. So, once again, I like to leave, and we're going through the green code in the city as well, which is a great code, but time will tell how good it is, because it's so prescriptive. I tease the architects saying, well, I don't need architects anymore, the code's telling me everything I gotta do here, you just gotta pick out color. So, they're concerned about kind of making it so prescriptive that all you're left to do is pick out colors.
Yeah.
There's an architect the other night at the Amherst Middle School I was talking to after the meeting, and that's exactly what he said too. He said, I'm to the point where all I have to do is feed it into the computer, and it's the same facade on every building that I'm building. Somebody's telling me exactly to do that. There's no creativity involved in this at all anymore.
Well, in order to address this, is there any thoughts on changing the language here to incorporate step backs in the rear? I guess the intent here would be in abutting residential areas.
I think it's, once again, I think you introduce language that says in step backs in the rear when appropriate, so it's suggested. It's from the planning board's perspective, they're going to look at a situation and say, geez, this is one of those situations where we think step backs are appropriate from the rear because there's only a 120-foot deep site or something like that. But, so it's suggested, it's implied that there's going to be times when that's encouraged and appropriate, and without necessarily mandating it, because I think that becomes problematic.
It's more appropriate for corridors, especially the shallow corridors, as opposed to centers, which maybe have enough depth that it doesn't matter. Plus, to play devil's advocate a little bit, the folks that come into meetings and talk about how close buildings are to the back, the first and second floor are still going to be just as close. And are we really helping the perception of the rear neighbors?
Yeah, I mean,
because they're the ones that won't see that third floor.
Go back to Duncan's comment a moment ago about, you know, how high houses are being built now anyway. You wonder where that step back should occur, at what level it's necessary or would be advantageous to have it. So maybe using the term where appropriate kind of gets to that comment.
I think where appropriate is real good, because it could be that what you'd put the step back on the street, but because it's a wide street and there's other tall buildings there, you don't really need the setback. But because there's residential close by behind, it would fit in to make a setback there. So I think it's leaving it sort of to the, I don't know how on the discretion, but where appropriate, I think makes good sense.
Okay, so we'll add that in there? That work for everybody? I'm on the second page of the public comments. So we just dealt with the first one, which is the step back. The next comment, once this new plan language goes into effect, it should be made sure that taller buildings should not be allowed in areas where it would be inappropriate. Not quite sure what to do with that one. I was looking on page 3-43. So there is discussion here about managing transitions. I don't think this might be the place to put something in here. And I guess the question really is, if we're focused on type here, do we have enough? Do we feel like there's enough guidance here? Again, this is going to go from a plan to a code with very specific, regulations. So do we need to put that in here, or do we need to kind of see how that plays out in the code? This is more of a implementation, kind of a execution issue, I think, more than a code or a plan issue. So, throw that out. And does anybody have any thoughts on that?
With respect to transitions, I haven't read everything in its entirety, but I'm just wondering, is there anything with reference to preserving, natural transitions? When we were at the small retail plaza at Clearfield, there was a defined natural transition. It was probably 75 feet wide, forest, separating the adjacent residential uses. So, that's something I want to see developed, at least in the code, how we can preserve natural transitions as effective visual breaks.
I think the comment here relates to, stringently enforcing the idea of height, and that it should not be allowed in places where it's inappropriate. And I guess the appropriateness is defined in the form and type that we've designated for those areas. So I'm not sure this is a comment we can do much with. I just wanted to see what folks said. I don't know if you put a statement in here that says that. I don't know that would be appropriate. And I just wondered if anybody had any other thoughts on it. If not, we can move on. Okay. Next comment, I think relates more to a zoning consideration with lighting. There was a gentleman there the other night who had provided some samples of information on lighting to the consultant. He just was following up to see whether or not those had been incorporated. Those are zoning issues. I think we'll deal with those when we get to the code, and any changes or recommendations we might get from the consultant on that. And then the last one really relates to the comment that we've had about stories versus feet in terms of defining the height. I think we probably addressed that one. Everybody feel comfortable with that? Okay. So there were a couple other written comments. I'll start with the first one. I think this is from Jane Cox. And the first comment she makes about the plan language is the idea of stories versus feet. Again, I think we've addressed that. The second one is the idea that fences may not be adequate to Jane Cox. Sorry. I think this comment relates to the adequacy of fences as a transition where the land uses are relatively tight. She's looking at the main Harlem area. Again, I think this is something we can try and deal with at the zoning level, but I wanted to determine whether anybody had any thoughts on this. Is there anything here that we should incorporate into the language, particularly as it relates to transitions, or are we satisfied with the discussion of transitions in the plan, and hope that we can deal with this comment at the code level? Okay, we want to deal with that at the code level? Okay, the next comment is from Mr. Cole, David Cole. He approached us at the end of the meeting and made reference to he calls it a town law and clearance that requires additional town board approval for any large buildings, like big box stores. I will readily admit we didn't have time to look into the clearance provision, but he mentioned that even a building as large as St. Mary's required this extra approval, and his comment was that Amherst should adopt a similar practice. Again, I'm not sure this is a plan level concern. It's more of a procedural thing, I think. Does anybody see any opportunity or need to incorporate this notion into the plan? Not that we'll lose track of it, but might be something the town board, okay? All right. There's another page I had from Linda Fusani from 320 Teakwood. This was, she attended the Transit Road meeting. Her primary concern, and as I mentioned earlier, the concerns of the trinkets related, at least in the first part, to noise and how we might be able to address noise in the code. So as we mentioned earlier, that would be something we would ask the consultant to consider when he's looking at the code. Is that? Yep.
I have a question about lighting. I don't have a lot of information about this, but I know there's somewhat of a national movement to reduce light pollution by having lights in parking lots and things shine downward rather than upward. Does the town have any rules about that?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
the last go-around with the code, a lot of those kinds of things were incorporated into the code. Not to say that, you know, I don't know that they've been revised, so, you know, certainly when Lee takes a look at the code this time, if there's some newer practices.
They're very comprehensive. Yeah, they're very comprehensive. As a matter of fact, we've gotten some pushback from a number of different establishments, like auto dealers, who like very high level of lighting. And of course, some of those are fairly close to residential areas, so there's been quite a bit of conversation in that regard. But right now, I think what the lighting standards we have now are pretty much consistent with what the lighting engineers are saying should be. May not please the auto dealers.
Again, one of the things we'll ask Lee to do is to see what opportunities might exist to review those and introduce any other newer contemporary practices that aren't reflected there. The second part of her comment relates to traffic safety. She cites Williamsville, Snyder, and Main Street as being higher speed areas, so she's really talking about trying to mitigate some of the effects of speed and making those streets more pedestrian-oriented. And her last comment relates to the same kind of concern she has about Transit Road and the idea of perhaps introducing a pedestrian bridge on Transit Road. I'm not sure there's an opportunity to introduce those ideas into this section of the plan. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
The example of the bridge over Sheridan and Tonawanda is not a good example to serve a purpose. That's a bridge that I don't believe DOT wants there anymore, and the town has a hard time maintaining it.
There's a lock on it. There's a lock on it. You can't use it any longer.
Failed a couple.
Their intent is to take it out. They tend not to be utilized because they restrict people's ability to move about the country freely. So if they want to cross down the street or they don't want to cross there, that's primarily for the school. But nonetheless, we can pass this information on to maybe the Traffic Safety Board. They could take that into consideration. The idea of doing some traffic calming kinds of things on Main Street in Williamsville and Snyder and Main Street, those are ideas that have been suggested before. I know the village is looking at doing some things with some funding they got recently. And it's my understanding that DOT is looking to resurface Main Street through Edwardsville and Snyder. Certainly when that occurs, there may be an opportunity to introduce some of these ideas to that project. I'm not sure where that is in the program. It's actually been slipping over the last several years. So
that program is a very low priority at this point in time, and it was done primarily to deal with some drainage issues in that corridor. And once they deal with the drainage issues, they would repave the road, but that's not going to happen shortly.
Shortly, yeah. Does anybody see anything in here that should be incorporated into the planning language that we're dealing with? Pretty much. Yeah, I think that's probably correct. Okay. That's essentially the only other comment I got was from Tom, who was talking about need to prioritize the support for redevelopment of vacant commercial properties along the Worley Drive corridor, and encouraging the AIDA to incorporate that into their policies. And again, I'm not sure, there is some discussion here about, in the plan, about vacant commercial properties, and, I don't know whether there's something here we would add that would call out Worley Drive. I don't think we have enough information to know, all of the opportunities that might exist for that kind of, concern. But I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, whether there's something here that should be incorporated or not.
If the plan talks about supporting redevelopment of vacant commercial properties...
It does.
Then it would include those on Worley.
Yeah.
It's covered.
So, any other thoughts? Anybody else pick up anything else in the public comments that may have overlooked here?
Dan, if I could,
Sure.
I think there was one thing that had some discussion that I don't think it really relates to the plan, but it does to the code, and that is if we set up some design standards, where does renovation or building ownership trigger the requirement to meet the new standards? That's a tough one.
The question on transfer of ownership.
Yeah, and it was pretty well explained. If it's just straight transfer of ownership, that's it. But I think I'm thinking more if somebody buys some property and takes a building down and rebuilds, or does major renovations to the building so it doesn't look anything like it is now, does it trigger the step-back issue or some of the others, or...
Adherence to these, to the new provisions of the code, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, would that kick those
Yeah.
in? And I think the answer was yes. I mean, I don't know if you want
Well, I think Darrell spoke to another comment, in that, if a property is sold, that doesn't necessarily mean when it's sold, it then has to comply with the current provisions. It continue to be
Based on
as
the
it is.
use.
But the code itself has requirements in it which indicate, if certain thresholds are reached, then you have to meet the requirements of the code. And then there's also a rather robust section in the code in regard to non-conforming uses. And the towns is pretty liberal in terms of expansion of non-conforming uses. But I think that particular section deals with the issue that you're talking about.
Is it clear enough at this point that it would incorporate what we're trying to do here?
Well, I mean, the one thing that we could do, and that this goes back to the code, is ask the consultant to take another fresh look at it, because it may well be that we want to make those thresholds a little more stringent, so that it triggers compliance with the code at a lower level. We'd like to see these buildings be consistent with the new code, and if you say, when the floor plate is changed by, let's say, 15%, then that area has to be consistent with the code. But again, more than anything else, I think we should ask the consultant to take a close look at the non-conforming regulations in the code.
that whole idea of transition could probably be worked a little bit. All right, so now I'm on page 45, 3-45. So is there anything, have I missed anybody, any comments anybody has up to page 45? Okay, okay, so I'm going sequentially through the document. So we bypassed any of those?
We didn't go page by page.
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying I'm on 45. So you want to go back? Well, yeah, let's
Do it now.
do it. So take us back where you want to be.
Page 16. I think there's a mistake, unless I'm misunderstanding what's said here. So, at the very bottom of the page, recreation and other large-scale community facilities. It refers, I'm sorry, 316. And it refers to typically comprised of several acres, then it talks about golf courses. Is that meant to say several hundred acres or over 100 acres? It just didn't seem to be in context with private golf courses and saying several acres. It just seemed small.
So, you're on 316, we're talking about recreation.
and other large-scale community facilities
Yeah.
typically comprised of several acres. These facilities, such as private golf courses, I don't know of a golf course that's several acres inside.
That's... Yeah, so what...
Correct, yeah.
So, I'm not tracking with you here. So you're on the first sentence?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, okay, so what you're suggesting is that needs to be...
I don't know if it's
Enlarged.
several hundred, but it's more than several acres. It just doesn't make any sense. Yeah, consisting of, up to 150 acres, because it's a typical golf course, 150 acres.
Now you're introducing metrics.
Several acres up to 150 acres. Well, I'm trying to help you here. You got several here. That's a metric, too.
Yeah.
We're not setting standards here.
Yeah, it's
trying
just-
to describe that these
yeah.
are large parcels.
And so we're into a section that doesn't really
Can't believe
apply to the work that we're doing here, right?
Hey, they got 150 acres.
Yeah, we're into something here that we hadn't proposed to look at. Let us take a look at it. Got it. What's next?
And I only had a comment on that page just because I thought it was funny. It talks about in the paragraph above under light industrial uses and research and development that, that these buildings could be converted to like residential or something. I mean, our industrial buildings in Amherst are not like the ones in the town, in the city of Buffalo. I don't know how you convert any of these little 16-foot buildings into residential, but it's just really more of an observation than anything else. It's not really a meaningful comment.
Which paragraph was that?
Don't worry about it. It's just really just
Okay.
a comment.
All right.
Because it was a little
Next.
funny. Yeah. Well, this is a question. So on page 21, open space system. So I know we're not changing this, but it kind of suggests the town doesn't have an open space system. When you read it, it's like it doesn't have one, and yet I think you pretty much kind of do. But am I missing something here? I'm on open space systems on page 21.
Yeah.
As I read it through the first time, it kind of read as if there's something the town needs to do, as if it doesn't have one yet. And I'm thinking, like, there is an open space system. There's been a plan. We are acquiring property. Is there any effort at all to update some of the older language, or just kind of... Once again, looking at the intent here, people don't know what's been amended, what's not been amended once it's done, so they're thinking, like, well, the town needs to do this. They haven't done it, but yet they've been doing it for 20 years.
Yeah, I'm not sure I read it quite the same way.
Like 3-13, the town should work towards establishing an interconnected open space network.
Yeah.
I think it's ongoing, right?
I think the statement is correct. And we have a number of open space parcels throughout the town, actually one of the largest ones in western New York. But what we lack is the connectivity of those, the interconnection of those.
Okay.
And I think what we're talking about here is we should be working towards that interconnectivity. And actually, to beat that horse a little more, that's going to be part of the recreation, park and recreation master plan.
Fair enough. Page 25. Once again, old language, sorry guys. I just was reading this and scratching my head. It's just above the paragraph F. It says, another option to consider is providing the town with the first option to purchase privately owned land shown on Parks Open Space and Trails Plan or as open space. I guess I'm questioning, who's providing that right? How's the property owner being compensated for granting the town this right? How does that actually get effectuated? It just seemed like a ridiculous statement to me. How could the town ever possibly acquire a first option to buy property? But the point is, that has value. You don't have a first option to buy my property.
Yeah,
I never granted to you unless you
I
paid
get
me
it.
for it.
I understand what you're saying.
So I don't even know how the town would ever actually even do that.
David, I'm going to respond in two ways. I know of other communities that have provisions like that. But now, don't ask me the question, how are they actually put into the law? I can't answer that question, but I do know there are communities that have provisions like that, where they have an opportunity when large parcels of land have an opportunity to basically have sort of a first refusal. I don't know exactly how that works, but they do it.
Fascinating.
Yes.
Just a question on page 29, the Table 2 chart. Are those percentages calculated from the revised plan that we did?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so when we talk about going from recreation open space from 10.7% today to 22.5%, that's based upon the calculations that were done from
That's
the
based,
plan as we...
that's based on this map,
Okay.
the land use pattern that's shown in this map.
And we talked about that one. Almost done here, guys. We covered that. Once again, a question. So 349, 3.3.3, which was mixed-use patterns, was crossed out, and it was called...
Page, sorry.
49.
49?
Then it was referred to as special activity centers, but yet the whole first section just talks about mixed use. You don't really get to special activity centers or special use centers later. Did we decide to just eliminate, I mean, it seemed like the section wanted to be called mixed use because the first two pages only talk about defining what mixed use is. You don't even get to special use center until like the third page. It just seemed like funny to cross mixed use out when it's...
I think we talked about this last meeting, that we didn't want to use the term mixed use because that's...
Well, it's using combination with commercial. So the 3.3.2 is commercial and mixed-use patterns. So I think, what I understand you saying, that there needs some modification to this.
Well, mixed use is used repeatedly throughout the first couple of pages, but yet it's crossed out into the heading. It doesn't seem to connect to what's the special activity center and mixed use connection.
Yeah, and I think the connection here is that these special use areas, as I mentioned earlier, we should encourage mixed use in those areas as they develop.
So maybe it's just the phrasing of that opening paragraph. Like I said, you see that, and you get in 2 pages of mixed use discussion. It keeps talking about mixed use, repeating the words mixed use, and yet I'm not really sure what the connection of that was to special activity centers, which are then later on called special use centers. It just it's really just more of a making sure people understand what we're trying to say there.
Okay.
I think I only have one more. Hooray! Yes.
Doors are set to lock automatically.
Okay. Well, once we leave, we're not coming back in.
Okay.
See you, Basil. Okay, Dave, where are we?
I'm on page 61. I'm just trying to decide whether or not there's a comment here worth making. We'll go to 62 instead. So, I think there's a little typo in there, in the red.
None of this language is proposed to change or is changing from the current plan. I got it, but understand that none of this has changed.
It's just a correction.
That's fine.
It says this area is envisioned as a location or university related. I think it was envisioned. I don't know if it still is. Is it still?
Where are you? Help me out
And
here.
then the second bullet under industrial uses on page 62.
Yep.
Is it is or was? Once again, just trying to make sure it's as clear as possible. Maybe it's supposed to be is. It looked like it should be was.
Okay.
And then, really, the whole industrial section, it talks about how the town of Amherst is well-suited for light industrial growth, but yet, I will tell you that there is absolutely no demand in Amherst for anything related to warehousing, and really no heavy manufacturing. There's a little bit here, but really, it's not an ideal climate for that. Basically, it's only R&D and light assembly. So I don't want folks to think that the town is anticipating they're going to get a lot of high-intensity industrial uses. So maybe the word light industrial or light intensity might be better, just because I think it helps describe, I think, what the town's catering towards and what our intention is. But if we want to leave open heavy manufacturing, we can, but it's...
I'm trying to find it.
It's how the last 2 paragraphs, how it's described.
Yeah.
It just says industrial. Industrial is a pretty broad category, just like other uses are, and I'm just trying to say that the industrial uses that are likely to occur here would be not warehousing and not distribution. We're not a highway networked community, and even the 290, you have very limited lengths you can put on that highway. It's really more light assembly, R&D, that kind of stuff.
It seems that that gentleman presented to the town board the economic study, and he was talking about the current parks that they all need help as soon as possible here in Amherst. So anything that wording here or in the code to facilitate that, I think would be appropriate.
I'll go back to what I said initially, that we recognize that, and it's our intention to go through a process similar to the one we're going through now, to come up with recommendations for amending the code to hopefully create a regulatory environment that supports changes in those uses. That's probably the best we can do right now. I'm a little concerned that we're dealing with that here is really sort of outside the lane, but I understand that David likes to have them correct, so.
Is that it? Okay. I think I have two more relatively minor, but, there's some existing language here on page 3-47, the bottom two paragraphs, which are intended to provide guidance with respect to, what we would call automobile, we called automobile-oriented, is probably better termed automobile-related uses, like motels, hotels, car dealerships, auto-related types of uses. This paragraph is here primarily because we wanted to provide some guidance in the plan so the town could effectively locate these when they come up in zoning petitions. So the current planning folks we have in the office really don't want to lose this guidance. They want to keep it in the plan because it helps them when they're making recommendations. When talking to Lee this afternoon, he thought maybe these would be better characterized as land-intensive uses, is a term that he used. And he suggested leaving the language relatively unchanged, but what we would do is we would take this from page 3-47 and move it back to 3-45 under the discussion of new centers, so the guidance kind of falls in with some of the other guidance that's been provided all along the way.
But then does that mean they would only be allowed in the designated new centers that we've already shown?
It would follow generally the guidance here, which says basically, we may have to change the language a little bit from community and regional centers to read centers or corridors with certain characteristics and move it back over into that area, yeah.
So auto-related uses would only be in the centers and the corridors.
Well, it's a little hard.
Identified.
The cat's out of the bag, right? This stuff is located out there already. So part of the problem here is to go back and try to tell you where it's going to go or where it should go when things are already pretty well established out there. So his suggestion was to leave it the way it was. Now, you're suggesting be more specific and identify where those...
No, I'm asking if Lee's suggestion was that these types of uses only occur in what we've already designated as commercial centers, or I'm sorry, corridors and
centers,
centers.
I think is what you mean. Yeah, if that's the guidance we want to provide, so new petitions, when people come and ask for these kinds of uses, that would be the guidance that you would provide here. Say they should be located in centers or along corridors. The problem is, there's corridors everywhere, and they have different characteristics. So is Bailey Avenue a corridor? It is in some cases. So we have to be more specific, I think, to get to where you want to be.
For this type of use.
Yeah.
So it's not universally allowed throughout all the districts.
Right. And that was the intent here originally. This is actually, if you're familiar with the plan as it exists today, this is pretty specific guidance. It says community and regional centers. It identifies, arterials and collectors, which are identified in the plan specifically, and suburban and commercial corridors, which are identified in the plan specifically. So, what we need to do, but that guidance remains in the plan. The functional classification of the roads is still there. The designation of suburban and commercial corridors is still there. So that guidance hasn't changed. The only thing that would be different here would be the idea of the scale of the community and/or regional center. I don't know if you have any thoughts on where you might want to introduce the form and typology here, or do you want to specify that, or you just want to leave it at the types of corridors and roads that it ought to be located. I'll leave that question, Ilona.
This is just bringing to mind, a rezoning that came in front of the town board, I think it was December 2015. We had, a hotel there on Niagara Falls Boulevard, which was in a hospitality, corridor, which was explained. And he wanted to knock it down, which eventually passed, the town board, but to put a CarMax there. And I always thought it was supposed to be a hospitality corridor there. Is this trying to say that, because I was opposed to having the car placed there instead of the hotel there, since there were so many hotels both in Tonawanda and on, if something like that can be written in, if or all of the hotels would have had to change, to accommodate this. Then I envisioned once it starts changing to an auto-related, then there could be more auto-related. Is this just what the market happens, or I was trying to keep what...
I think in a lot of respects it is. The value of the land is an auto-related use is probably higher than it was as the hotel that was there. Yeah.
And it's just, I don't know, that could be the first time somebody sees Amherst. They come off the 290 and there's a car place.
When we were working with the planning board, the staff struggled with this issue. Because we had, that particular area, was an area where hospitality uses should be located right there at that intersection, particularly in view of the relationship with the shopping which occurs to the south of there. But there wasn't any guidance in the comprehensive plan that we could hang our hat on that would give us basically an opportunity to recommend recommend to the planning board that staff recommends that it be denied. There was nothing in the plan that provided us with that guidance.
So right now...
So that hotel was obsolete. It was time for it to go. And if for some reason you could have put a restriction in place that could only be used for a hotel, my guess is the property would have sold for half of what it sold now, because somebody would pay for the cost of demolition. Apparently CarMax will do one location, they can afford to spend $7 million for a piece of property. But because of that $7 million purchase, that means that the property value of their land went up that much, probably more so than if it had been resold for something else, if it was hospitality and somebody did a 80-room Hampton there or something like that. So, from a tax-based perspective, that's probably a good thing what happened there, although, I go down that intersection all the time, you think like, geez, they couldn't do better than CarMax there. It's not something I like to see, but once again, car dealerships have a right to be somewhere. They got to go somewhere too. If it's not there, where are they going, right? Tough one.
Well,
is there a concern?
Not to beat this horse too much again here, but what happened on the south side of that interchange was probably, as in terms of redevelopment, taking a building and redevelopment, was probably the proper way of dealing with the north side, where you would take that low-rise old-fashioned motel and put up a higher-rise structure there. To me, that would have been a better solution from a community planning point of view, not a CarMax.
Is there a concern to have guidance where you want your motor service districts? Is that the intent here?
Yes.
Just your motor service district?
No, we're calling these land-intensive uses, and it would be motor service and/or auto-related uses. Like Lee basically said, motels don't exist anymore. I don't know if that's true or not, but hotels do, obviously. So
hotels don't exist anymore.
Okay, no more motel. So we would drop the term motel. But yeah, auto-related uses. Your Mr. Oil Change, your repair shops, your car dealerships, and hotels would be what this would be directed to. Do you have anything else to say about that? No.
I'm just looking at the zoning ordinance now.
Yeah.
All we're concerned about is where we're going to. I don't envision. A hotel is transportation oriented, but
That's why it's not called auto-related or auto-oriented. It's, automobile or land-intensive, kind of automobile-related, and then comma, hotels, land-intensive kinds of uses. The one thing here I think that probably needs some thinking is this, the last sentence, which says, "These uses should be located within existing or proposed," and says, "community and regional centers located along arterial and collector highways designated suburban and commercial corridors." So, as I mentioned before, these terms, arterial and collector and suburban and commercial corridors, are defined in the plan, and that guidance remains. The question is whether or not you would want to introduce a form and type to this to relate back to the map. Would you want this to be, proposed centers and selected corridors, or something of that, or corridors as follows kind of thing in the guidance here? Something that would be more specific. It gets away from the old scalar terms that are used here now.
When we think about these, what I call extensive uses, those are uses where maybe the capital investment is quite small, but the amount of land that you need for that operation. It used to be the classic lumber yard, and we had those areas. I think that the definition of where those extensive uses could continue, or where they should be located, could continue as it is in the plan, but it may well be that we need something in the plan which would indicate that we should avoid them at these places, like where you have an interstate and an arterial coming together, or a collector coming together, like the CarMax site. We could craft some language that would say those are not the places where you want those types of uses. You want the uses more like what's happening in University Corporate Park, although there's no interchange there, and elsewhere in the town.
Slippery slope, though. So you could talk about a hotel can be done in as small as 2 acres, right? Limited service hotel and a restaurant, and do that in 2 acres. Full service hotel, it's probably a minimum of 10. Same thing with car dealership. You could probably do a used car dealership in an acre, but a full service dealership like a CarMax, probably one in all of Western New York, is going to be 15 acres. So if you start going down that slope, then you got to begin to differentiate, because to say you're not going to put a small limited service hotel in one of these locations and somehow lump that in with a full-service hotel that might take 15 acres, they're completely different. Although they're in the same family, they're completely different scales.
Well, I think we could agree that these kinds of uses may not be appropriate in traditional areas. I say that, now probably somebody will tell me different, but given the limitations, I don't know if will we build a hotel that's...
Well, I will share with you that
two stories.
Trends now in hospitality, because, of course, when we were a car-driven society, everybody wanted to be on an interchange. Before the internet, you needed to be visible to be seen. And it's still important. People want, Hilton, Hyatt, Marriott, they all want to have the billboard of the hotel on the highway, so they're building brand recognition. However, a lot of the boutique hotels that are being built off the highway, more into village centers, such as the Hampton on Main Street in the Village, which has done extraordinarily well, because once you're there, you're walkable. So there is a thrust to go into little villages or something, kind of build your boutique hotel or 60, 80 rooms, where you have less pressure to provide all these services in the hotel because they're there, and it gets your folks there and they get out and walk around. So I think, and once again, looking ahead, I think right now our region has plenty of hotels, doesn't need anywhere for a while, but once again, this is a 10, 15-year plan. That would be, I can see somebody wanting to do that in the village of Williamsville, I can see somebody wanting to do that in the village of Hamburg or other places. So that is the trend now, is to kind of do these limited service hotels, but very nice, very nicely done, but doing them in villages, not in the traditional locations where they've been historically. But they're always going to be on a major thoroughfare, or very close to it. They're never going to be in some hidden area where they can't be seen. That's just not ideal unless it's a resort.
You are saying that the prime location for these name brands are where you have a Youngman Expressway and a 9-foot boulevard coming together.
Sorry, repeat that again?
But what you just said, still these hotels like the Neiman, the Hyatts, the Marriotts and what have you, they're still looking for those sites, which are where you have two major...
That's correct, yeah, you're not going to do it on Young's Road. It's still going to be out of your Main Street or, yes.
What you want to do is to say, let's put a CarMax there,
mean, the use is correct, the form was incorrect, so we go from there before.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, any desire to try to put some kind of form and type designation on this? Or should we just drop the community and regional description here and just go with centers, which we'll have to try and differentiate from the term center that we use in the other part of the plan? Or we could define it and just say, it certainly could go in proposed centers or corridors as defined by arterial collectors, suburban and commercial corridors.
Centers and corridors starts to get you back towards...
Absolutely does.
types we talked about.
Yeah, and I guess...
Community, regional, just say centers and corridors. And I think once you delete everything between 345 and this part of 347, you have the introductory paragraph for new centers, and then this paragraph
Yep.
that says where these intensive things will happen, and then the last paragraph of this subsection is saying what won't happen.
Right, right. So everybody's okay with that, we'll move that back to 345. And then the other thing I have to move is the discussion of historic hamlets, which is Swarmville and Gettsville. And the idea here would be to maintain those as they're written in here, but to move that back so it follows the land-intensive uses, so it's guidance about those particular areas. Anybody opposed to that? We'll bring that back to the area around 345, leaving the language the way it stands. Anybody? Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me that. Yeah.
Dan, I know it's late, I just have one more.
Yep. Mark, can I just, are we good with that, moving those back?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Yep, sorry, just want to make sure.
This may be a big issue that we have to address sometime in the future, and maybe I'm just being naive, but on 345, the section we just spent so much time talking about, new centers, the last sentence of that paragraph is very meaningful. The maps in this section may need to be amended by the town board prior to rezoning, assuming we mean the comprehensive plan map.
Yes.
Now, I know that is what's happened over the years, but should it? Or should we finish the comprehensive plan and say, plan's finished for a while, and instead of looking at changing the comprehensive plan every time someone wants to rezone, maybe we should consider the rezonings based on the comprehensive plan primarily. And I know this is probably a sea change here, and
I agree. I mean,
I would like to strike the maps in this section may need to be amended by the town board prior to rezoning to reflect the addition of any new centers. If we're trying to suggest over the next 20 years, there shouldn't be a need to create new activity centers, then let's agree to leave that as is for the next 20 years. Why encourage someone to change the comprehensive plan?
or 5 years before we review it. And I know it's a big change.
I think this is here to provide that relief that no one in this room can likely anticipate may or may not be needed. That this is that flexibility with the caveat or the contingency in it that would allow the town to make decisions on opportunities that may present themselves that we can't anticipate right now. That's my thought on that.
And this is one of those other paragraphs where I mentioned before, this theme's repeated several times, and the other area it said, if at all, and this one says, if any. Once again, I think it's very clear, and the intent here is to really discourage, but I'm trying to avoid any language that says it could never happen, or it could be construed to be, it could never happen, because it just creates conflict later on.
I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to suggest that what Lee is saying here is that the amendment of the plan is a discrete action. I mean, that would be the way I would interpret. I don't know if you have the same interpretation. So that the map needs to be amended before the zoning is approved.
Can we at least separate them, that, to say that zoning shouldn't happen contrary to the maps as they are when this is adopted, unless there's consideration of changing the maps? It just seems like we're saying that if you want to do a rezoning, we'll change the map.
If you want to do a rezoning that's inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. Yeah. This is looking at a situation from two different perspectives. One is that if you want to rezone a piece of property which is inconsistent with the comprehensive plan, then you need to go back and amend the plan before you do that.
I read this as a regulatory burden.
Pardon?
I mean, when I read this, I thought that this is intended to mean that, okay, there's very limited opportunity to do this, but if you're going to do it, you're going to have to go through this step. I almost kind of interpret it as like this is meant to kind of almost be perceived as an additional regulatory burden.
I think that was the point I was trying to get at. Yeah.
And I interpret...
It feels like it's stronger.
At the same time, to a degree where you can read it and say, well, it kind of encourages a town board to take the easy route, change the map, change the rezoning, when you should be, if you're going to change the map, it should not necessarily be on a case-by-case basis. It should be on a comprehensive look at the community.
I agree with that, but I think it's being reduced to the fact that you only have to change the map within the comprehensive plan. I think when you change, if you're seeking a rezoning that's inconsistent with this, you have to look at this in its entirety, and the original intent. By simply indicating that you have to change the maps, I think it reduces it to a more simplistic procedure. And that's where I'm getting at.
I think it's the way it's written, whether it's intended or not, it's putting it's almost saying, well, the town board's going to have to do this if there's rezoning, and it just needs to be restated that if the town board decides to do this, then those other steps will follow. By saying need to be, it's suggesting that's something the town board has to do. So I think that's a good catch.
To a degree, it's talking about procedure. At the same time, what I'm hearing is there's a concern here about that procedure being something which is sort of perfunctory, and that you can just do it, without a great deal of forethought and changing, just because you want to rezone the property. I think that the way the system should work is that if you're going to change the land use classification for a piece of property and change the zoning on it, that needs to be part of a more comprehensive view of what the community wants to do. It shouldn't be essentially on a case-by-case basis. The way it's written here, I think that you could get that sense. And I read it both ways. Yeah, you can read it. You can read it both ways. Yeah. I think you're right.
So, state your intent. I mean, really, how do you want this to work?
I guess I would have to, to carefully give you the language. I mean, because it has to be consistent with, we'd have to cite New York State town law. That has to be, I just don't want it to suggest that, because we did amend this to accommodate a rezoning recently, and it's rare that you do that, and it was done. And I want to try to discourage that from happening again, unless there's some careful forethought in doing that.
Daniel, is it something more than, as a precondition to the town's adoption of, or approval of a new commercial area, the map, the requirement that the map would be amended? So it's pretty clear that it's a precondition, it's another layer. I think you want it to be more comprehensive to the plan, but it begins to clarify this, that this is an additional step, an additional layer, and it's a precondition of any consideration that the town board would give to a new commercial district.
I think I'm having just trouble with the use of the word map, because it's not inclusive of this whole document, which is a very thorough thought process. Because a comprehensive plan, I mean, you don't even need this as long as there's a rational method and procedure in doing something, so I just don't like to use, narrowing it to the word map.
This plan may occasionally be amended based on the changes in land use trends and demands, something like that, just more about the need, something else has changed to trigger the amendment of the plan and the plan maps, something else other than a petition for rezoning.
You know, maybe just taking the word map out would be helpful. I'm listening to Dan, and a couple of other things come up, and one is that this is an adopted plan, and under New York State town law, the town board needs to follow the adopted plan in terms of the land use decisions they make. So that's covered there, but there should be a more thoughtful process involved with making those changes in the map, or changes in the plan. And the one thing that we need to be cognizant of is that the plan map itself, Figure 6, has got has a disclaimer on it, which in essence says that you should not just be following this map. This shows land use relationships. You should be looking at the other elements of the plan, the narrative part of the plan as well, to provide you with some guidance. I mean, there's one policy statement there which is extremely important in terms of land use pattern. That is, we discourage commercial uses along some of the major roads like Sheridan Drive and Maple Road. We want to maintain the residential character of this, the essential residential character for major portions of those roads. Although that is shown to a degree on the map, that's a very strong policy statement. And if you're going to begin to put some commercial uses down along that corridor, then there's more to be changed than just the map.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to be clear. The reason I ask is I want to be clear on the intent, because I'm sure he says maps in here explicitly, because what he's saying is if you're going to change the land use pattern, you need to give thoughtful consideration to these maps. There is guidance here, as Rick alluded to earlier, but it kind of boils down to, I'm guessing it's map 6A. 6 is generalized, 6A is not. It's very specific. And I think his intent here is to say if you're going to entertain a petition for rezoning, then you ought to separately entertain the change to map, and I suggest it's probably 6A, before you change the zoning. That's the way I read this.
And I think Rick made it very clear. I mean, in New York State, there's a procedure to change a comprehensive plan, and it's a thorough procedure. So I'll let you and the staff further discuss it. I don't want to, belabor the point, but it's just using the word map and only map concerns me.
I was more probably thinking they could just work this evening, taking the word map out and putting plan in. The plan needs to be amended, which could be more than just
the text. So the implication is the map because I'm sure his intent is that it's the map that has to change. So by implication,
that map, 6 and 6A are part of the comprehensive plan.
That's right.
So if you say amend the plan and that affects the map, then you have to change the map.
So we're clear on that. Okay.
All right. Anything else?
Sorry, one other kind of a laughable one in here. Page 361, notwithstanding our building there, which is very modern, it refers to the large, modern suburban corporate office development along John James Audubon Parkway. And I got to tell you, that's one of the office corridors in the town that's probably the most tired and disconcerting, the highest vacancy rate. So it seems funny to have it characterized as a large, modern suburban corporate office development, notwithstanding our beautiful building at 2410 North Forest.
Contrasting it with SJ.
Yeah, and then you have this, while Amherst contains a growing proportion of office development, I think office development's shrinking, not growing, so I'm not sure where those terms come from.
Clearly, this is why Dave Purcell did the study that he did. We looked at this and we said,
Well, then, this language is kind of in contradiction to his...
Absolutely.
And it's not that meaningful in the context of the overall plan, but as I'm looking at it, saying, it's kind of, well, I wish.
It's gotta be changed then.
Have you just deleted the words modern, suburban, corporate? Did that,
Suppose we put it whole entire.
without all that?
Yeah, you could just take out the word
Yeah.
modern, it's the simplest thing to do. And
Let me-
take out the word
Yeah.
growing proportion of office space.
Let me suggest that we defer the decision on this until we get through the next, let's call it the next phase, when we deal with office buildings. You know, outside of this, we're going to be discussing this again. I'm not sure it's the same characters, but we'll be discussing this again. And that obviously has to be changed. It was written in a different time.
Red stuff, right, so that's the new stuff? Am I misreading?
Was it?
Yeah.
You have...
Not sure at this point.
All right, listen, are you buying breakfast?
Am I buying breakfast?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you do on Friday mornings, but we're talking about,
I'm telling you where it's going to be.
are we all invited tomorrow morning for breakfast? Because it's almost there already now. Right, Amy? Amy wants to go home. Okay, housekeeping. Next meetings, joint committee meeting, June 28th. Joint committee meeting, July 26th, here at 7 o'clock at Village Hall. You got it on your agenda there? Okay. Before we adjourn, any public comment? Wait, hold on a second. I may have gone too fast.
So I need to know what we're doing with this, because the next step for this is to take it to the planning board, and they're looking to do that at their
June meeting.
in June. In order to do that, we need to finalize the document. We need to have your endorsement of the document before it goes. So, there's a couple ways to deal with this. We can have another meeting to talk about the changes that are made with respect to your comments tonight. If you
feel confident that we can make these changes, then we'll make the changes and move it forward. I think those are probably the only two options right now, another meeting or move it forward, but it has to, that next meeting will have to be relatively soon, probably within the next week or so.
At a minimum, for me, I don't know if we need to meet again. I mean, at some point in time, we have to place some faith in, it's not a final document that's going up, but I would not want to release what we have today, because I think we've proposed a lot of changes, but I think we've given good comment. We got good consultant, good planning department, make the changes, release it. There's little boo-boos in there, we'll catch up to them, but I think we need to get them out, but I wouldn't let the version go out that we have now. That's my opinion.
No, I'm gonna, when you say release it, our intent is to endorse it and move it on to the planning board for hearing in June, and thereafter, whatever action would take place after that, so.
This committee would get a copy of, what you send out, what you give to the planning board?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We'll do this, you follow the same protocol. We'll finalize the document, it'll be available on the website for everybody, and we'll get a copy to the committee. So, is that?
I'm comfortable with that. Yeah. Take a vote, in my direction. You all set?
Okay, all in favor of accepting the document with corrections being made as suggested this evening and passing it on to the planning board for the June 22nd meeting, please raise your hand. Okay, unanimous. You're welcome. Okay, public comment.
Thank you. I'm Tom Frank, and I'd like to speak to Ramona. I've talked to her in the past regarding a proposal for a resolution amending the comprehensive plan for the southern Amherst, Worley Drive, mixed-use, special use, commercial corridor zoning code. That this is important for connecting, and I did speak to David. I gave him this information. He put it in here, and he presented it to the board, and the people from the Erie County Department of Environment and Planning I told them it's going to be in the comprehensive plan. And the mayor of the village passed a resolution for the Ellicott Creek watershed greenway parks and trails. As far as the interconnectivity of these parks, it serves an economic development purpose long-term in terms of the watershed. And the governor signed a bill, okay, for the Ellicott Creek as a natural waterway. It's 112 miles. They've got flooding in Lancaster today as we're sitting here, that this is a model, and it ties into and the governor also signed another bill that the maintenance, that these issues are interconnected. As far as the NYSERDA grant for $161,250 is for a major statewide initiative, and that's what this is. As far as the partnerships to transform markets and reduce emissions, we're talking about something that's going to affect the reduction of and that's what this project was for, was to reduce the emissions on Main Street. The village of Williamsville is in the town of Amherst, and so as far as the project of CFA application, we're talking about a $50 million project over a 5-year period with 5 different phases for converting the toll barriers into a visitor information center with Delaware North Corporation. As far as I Love New York and the path through history. And but this is going to affect Cheektowaga and Clarence. Clarence on Worley Drive. Clarence put in but also this would resolve the issue as far as the $4 million that they flushed down the toilet with the developer owner. That this is...
Tom, your time is up.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Worley Drive.
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you.
Take the microphone.
Thank you, committee. My name is Don Smith. Watching your work tonight, I learned an awful lot about the dynamics of what your committee does. I understand the work you do is difficult and it's time-consuming, and it takes a lot of commitment and effort. That all being said, I am very disappointed. I see a few people talking, I see committee members missing. I see a process that doesn't really take into consideration what the town of Amherst residents are really going to be seeing. What comes out of this committee, what has come out of the committee, what we see is what's going to come out of this committee. We also won't see things that won't come out of this committee. So you have very big control over these things, what's going to happen to us as the residents of Amherst. You put in place here, I've seen Mr. Chiazza taken an awful long time discussion here. I've seen Mr. Gillard do the same. I'm not sure that the committee here participated to the degree that I would have liked to see them participate in the process of all members being involved in the process. I appreciate some of the other members here trying to balance the process. Personally, I see the work you're doing here being more in a bubble, being essentially non-connected to the residents of Amherst, with very few comments, with a very limited, and Mr. Giuliani's looking to make sure that I get 3 minutes and 3 minutes only in my comments. Obviously, you do want to hear from us, because you want to limit our time. But you need to, because we're important. We're the people that's going to be, you're going to be controlling, and your actions are going to be affecting very much and very important. I like the issues that Mr. Lutowski brought up very often. I'm very happy with all that. I understand Mr. Chiazza is an implementer. He's a builder. I understand that too. Builders build, planners plan, and frankly, you ain't, from my point of view, you're really not taking into considerations of the people and the residents of Amherst. And possibly, that's mostly their own fault for not being involved. But I learned an awful lot here, much of which does not make me happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, if we don't have any other business to conduct, we will adjourn for the evening, or I should say the morning.